A 9-year-old girl named Kim was walking to the corner store to get some pasta sauce for her mother. On her walk home, a man she had never met before walks up behind her and speeds up to where he's walking in step with her. And he looks at her and introduces himself and says, "Hi, I'm Dr. Ramsey. I'm a pediatrician. Do you know what a pediatrician is?" And Kim immediately had a bad vibe about this Dr. Ramsey character. There was just something odd about him. The fact that he had approached her so suddenly and was right on top of her. So her reaction was to not answer his questions and instead put her head down and walk even faster because she knows she's almost at her house. She's almost at safety, and if she can just get there, she doesn't have to deal with this strange man. But as she sped up, so too did Dr. Ramsey, staying in step with her, and he begins peppering her with additional questions and comments. "Are your parents looking for a pediatrician for you?" "Of course they are. You're a big girl now. How old are you? What's your name? Your hair is so beautiful. Where do you live?" When Kim got to be about 10 meters away from her house, she just takes off running, and she bolts up her back steps through the kitchen door into her house, slams the door behind her, and for a few seconds, she just stands there, almost anticipating hearing this Dr. Ramsey guy come up the back steps behind her. But he doesn't, and after a couple of minutes, she pokes her head around and looks out the window, and he's not there anymore. And she feels completely relieved that that weird guy is now gone, and she can just forget about it. But it turns out she couldn't just forget about this, because Dr. Ramsey was not going away anytime soon. It wasn't long after this first initial interaction with Dr. Ramsey that Kim was home one day, and she happened to be looking out her front window to the road, and she sees a blue Ford Galaxy drive slowly by their property. And she's looking at the car and she can tell immediately that the person driving it is Dr. Ramsey. But Dr. Ramsey doesn't see her. She's kind of obscured behind curtains on the window, and she's watching him, and he was looking at their front door and he was waving as if there was someone standing on their front steps, but Kim knew there wasn't. And so he bizarrely just drove the rest of the way past their property, waving the whole time, and then drove off. Now at this point, Kim has not told her mom or her dad or her siblings about Dr. Ramsey, because that first interaction, she kind of chalked it up to maybe her being paranoid and maybe even being a little bit rude that she ran away from this doctor who was just trying to talk to her. But now that she's seen him drive past her house and he's acting strange, her alarm bells are starting to go off. But she doesn't tell her parents quite yet. But the next day when Kim was playing outside, a car drove by and she turned to look at it, and it was the blue Ford Galaxy, and who was driving? Dr. Ramsey. And he slows down and he waves to her and he smiles at her as he passes by, and she kind of looks at him like, "What are you doing?" At this point, Kim knows he's acting inappropriately. Whatever his angle is, it just didn't feel right. So she runs inside and she explains to her mom that when she went to the store to get that pasta sauce on her way back, this strange man, Dr. Ramsey, approached her. She came back to the house. Now I've seen him twice outside of our property and he's clearly waving at me. There's something wrong with this guy. Kim's mother reacted to this news the way most of us would, which is, you're talking about a doctor in this nice neighborhood who's driving down the road saying hi to my kid, and he claims he's a pediatrician. Like, that's a child's doctor. It makes sense he might be waving to kids. That's part of his job, talking and interacting with kids. And so her mother says this can't be a big deal. I'm sure he just works in the area and this is part of his commute going down this road, and now you've seen him a couple days in a row. It's just a coincidence. But shortly after this, when Dr. Ramsey started calling their house, Kim's mother and father very quickly ditched the "he's a doctor so we can trust him" routine and became very concerned. A couple of days after Kim had told her mother about Dr. Ramsey, Kim gets called into the living room where her father's sitting, and he looks very troubled. And he calls her over and has her sit down, and he says, "You're not in trouble. I just need you to talk me through exactly what happened when Dr. Ramsey approached you. Your mother told me about it, and there's been a couple weird things that have happened here, and I just got to hear the story from you." And so Kim goes through the story. She describes how she was leaving the store. He just kind of showed up, and Kim did not talk to him. She put her head down and basically ran back to the house, and that was it. Kim's father reacts to this like he's totally perplexed about something, that he's hearing the facts, but they don't make any sense. And he says to Kim, "Are you sure you didn't say anything to him?" And Kim said, "No, I was scared. I didn't say anything." And Kim's father's like, "Then how did he know your name?" Kim was like, "What do you mean?" And her father said, "Well, just the other day, I got a phone call from someone saying they were Dr. Ramsey, and they asked to speak with you, Kim, by name. They said, 'Can I speak to Kim?' And I thought that was odd because, you're my child." And I said, "Well, why do you need to speak to my daughter? Why can't you speak to me? I'm her father. You're a doctor. You can speak to me." And they hung up. And then they called back again, and they asked for you by name again, as if they hadn't heard me the first time. And so I said again, "Why do you need to talk to my daughter? You can just talk to me. I'm her parent." at which time they hung up again. And so I wanted to hear from you directly if you had given your name to him, because the fact that he knew your name on that call seems really odd to me. Kim assured her father that she did not give him her name. And you got to remember that this is back in 1978, so Dr. Ramsey would not have been able to use the internet to try to find Kim's name, nor would Kim's name have been listed in a telephone book because she was a minor. It would have been her father or her mother that was listed in the telephone book. So in order for Dr. Ramsey to have her name, he would need to know someone that would give up her name or do some digging, which is obviously very creepy considering the fact that Kim has never met him before. He's a strange older man and she's a 9-year-old girl. So with that in mind, Kim and her parents are on edge about this Dr. Ramsey character, but they don't have any clear recourse because he didn't do anything that was criminal. They couldn't go to the police and say he figured out our daughter's name, because they would be saying a doctor, a pediatrician no less, knows our child's name and was waving and smiling at her. But shortly after this, Dr. Ramsey's behavior would take a dark turn. He would call Kim's house again just a couple of days after those first 2 calls, and Kim's father would answer, and right away, Dr. Ramsey says, "I need to talk to Kim." And Kim's father goes into protective mode and he says, "Do not call this house again," and he hangs up. But seconds later, the phone is ringing again, and at this point, the family has come in the room because they heard their father screaming at someone on the phone. The phone's ringing, and their father picks the phone up and puts it back in the receiver, canceling the call. And he looks at his family and he says, "Do not answer the phone." The phone rings again. He picks it up and cancels it again. On and on, the phone rang incessantly all night until they disconnected the phone line. The next day, when they plugged the phones back in, Kim's parents told all of the kids, "Do not answer the phone. No matter what, don't answer the phone." And once again, the phone starts ringing, and Kim's father picks it up. He doesn't say anything, and he hears on the other end of the line, Dr. Ramsey asking for Kim. And he says, "Do not call this house again," and he slams it, thinking that's going to do it, but of course it doesn't. And over the next several days, anytime the phone was plugged in, it was practically a non-stop call from Dr. Ramsey. And one time when Kim's father did pick up the phone, he reacted to it like it was some horrible thing being told to him. And he put it down, he disconnected the phone, and he went into the kitchen. And one of Kim's brothers overhears their father talking to their mother in a hushed tone, and he's saying to her, "He just told me he's going to hurt Kim unless he can speak to her." After this threat was made, things got very complicated. Back in the 1970s, there weren't any stalking laws that would protect Kim and her family from Dr. Ramsey. Even though Dr. Ramsey had just threatened Kim, there was no proof he had done that, and he hadn't done anything physical, and so there wasn't any legal recourse. The police couldn't really do anything. And so Kim's father ends up calling one of his friends who happens to be a police officer. He explains the situation and he says, "Would you mind for the next little bit just escorting my daughter Kim to and from school, because we don't want her to be out walking around by herself with this guy rolling around the neighborhood." The friend says yes, and he began bringing Kim to and from school, and Kim felt a lot safer with her father's friend because you have this police officer that's walking around with you. But it also isolated Kim in a really major way. She wasn't really allowed to go outside anymore without an escort, which meant her life was confined largely to being inside almost 24/7, and there was no clear resolution in sight for how to handle Dr. Ramsey. And so it was like this indefinite period of time that Kim was just not going to be allowed to have a normal life. Once Dr. Ramsey was completely cut off from any interaction with Kim, I mean, she barely went outside, and when she did, she was with this police escort, and she never answered the phone. Once that was going on, Dr. Ramsey became desperate. One evening, Kim, her sister, 2 of her brothers, and her mother were in the kitchen chatting when one of her brothers suddenly reacts like he sees something out the back window that leads out to their garage. And he runs over and he's looking out, and Kim and her family are turning to him saying, "What do you see? What's going on?" And he goes, "There's someone in the garage." And they all run to the windows and they're looking out, and there's a window on the side of their garage. Their garage was detached from their house. And there's a window on the side, and there was this man there standing there looking out at them. And once he saw that everybody is looking at him, he ducked his head down. And as Kim's family is looking at each other like, did we really just see someone in the window? Because it's kind of dark and they're not there anymore. Suddenly, the garage door slowly rises up, and out pops a man who stands up, looks at them just long enough that Kim yells, "That's Dr. Ramsey. I saw him. That's Dr. Ramsey." And then the guy takes off down the driveway away from their house. And Kim's 2 brothers immediately run out the house and chase him down the road. But eventually he darts into another property and he disappears, and they can't find him. Kim's mother calls the police. They show up. They take down some statements. And they basically say, "Look, if he comes back, let us know. But for now, just go back in your house and lock the doors." And keep an eye out. For 2 weeks after the garage incident, they didn't hear from Dr. Ramsey and they didn't see Dr. Ramsey. And it was this great reprieve from this very stressful time in their lives. But after those 2 weeks, Kim's father walked outside onto their front porch and he saw their beloved German Shepherd was dead lying off the side of the porch. And he goes over to the dog and it looks like it's been roughed up, but it's hard to tell what actually happened to it. Now, at first, the family is absolutely devastated about the loss of their beloved animal. But shortly after that, they start thinking, do you think Dr. Ramsey could have had something to do with the death of our dog? And so Kim's father calls the police and says, I think our stalker, Dr. Ramsey, killed our dog. But the police would say there was no evidence to suggest anybody killed your dog. It could have just been an accident. Also, we haven't even been able to identify who this Dr. Ramsey person is because there are no Dr. Ramseys in this town. And so probably he's using a fake name. So the family's sad and frustrated, but once again has nothing they can do about this. That night, Kim and her family are sitting at home. They're all very sad about the loss of their dog, and the phone rings. Now, prior to this, there had been 2 weeks where Dr. Ramsey hadn't called once. And so Kim's father picks the phone up and says, hello? And it's Dr. Ramsey. But unlike all the other calls where Dr. Ramsey almost always began with put Kim on the phone, this time he started with, there are 7 people in your house right now. Your wife's in the kitchen, you're in the living room, your 3 sons are watching TV in the den, and your 2 daughters are upstairs in their respective bedrooms. Kim's father is obviously horrified to hear this because it was all accurate. And he just screams into the phone, stay away from my family, and he hangs up. After this phone call, Kim's father was naturally very shaken up by this because even though they knew Dr. Ramsey was probably living in the area and he clearly drove past the property and was local, it just felt way more intimate for him to be naming things that meant he had to have been near their house recently and looking in windows. And so Kim's father runs around the house and makes sure all windows are shut and locked, blinds drawn, all the doors are locked, and then he goes all around the house to make sure all his kids and his wife and everybody's okay. And then afterwards, he considered calling the police, but felt like it was kind of futile because to this point, they haven't been able to help them and nothing has changed. It was just another creepy phone call. And so they don't do anything. The next day, they plugged their phone line back in because they need to use a phone, and shortly thereafter, the daily calls with Dr. Ramsey began again. And now, every call, whenever they did pick up, started with Dr. Ramsey identifying who was in the house and where they were. After a couple of days of this, the family was just living in paranoia. It was this horrible time in their lives, and one night, the phone rings, and Kim's father picks it up, ready to just scream at this guy and take out his frustrations, and Dr. Ramsey, instead of giving the report, starts by saying, I can open your kitchen window and I can open your French doors to the side of your house. Kim's father is about to yell at him, but instead just hangs the phone up and runs into the kitchen and he checks the window and he knows it's faulty. And clearly, so does Dr. Ramsey. And so he gets a piece of twine and he ties it over the latch and gets it as tight as he can. And then he ran over to the French doors, which were faulty. You'd have to push pretty hard, but you could, in theory, pop the doors open if you knew these were faulty doors. And so Kim's father is not taking any chances and he gets some nails out of the junk drawer and he nails a row of nails into the ground, right into the hardwood, sitting immediately outside the frame of the door. So if you were to push on them, you would just butt up against the heads of these nails and it would keep it shut. It was his temporary solution until he ordered a proper lock to fit on the door. At this point, it was safe to say Kim and her family were living in fear that Dr. Ramsey at any given point could just break into their house, because clearly he was canvassing their house and testing different entry points, and he had already found 2. And so now they just felt totally unsafe in their house. But oddly enough, after that last call where Dr. Ramsey had said he knew the kitchen and the doors were faulty, the calls from Dr. Ramsey decreased to almost 0, and they didn't see him anywhere, and it started to feel like maybe he had gotten his thrills and he was moving on now. And it just so happened that around the time the family is starting to think this could be over, the mother and father had to go to this company function where the kids couldn't go. So the kids would be alone, but the kids said, we're fine with it. We have each other. The house will be locked. We won't go anywhere. And the parents, even though they hated the idea of their kids being alone at all, because of everything going on with Dr. Ramsey, they felt like, it does seem like he's kind of moved on and we're only going to be gone for a couple of hours, so I'm sure this is going to be fine. So that night, after her parents leave, Kim is sitting on the couch, she's watching TV, her younger brother is laying on the ground right in front of her, and her sister is sitting on the other end of the couch and she's on the phone. And Kim said she found herself looking out of her room into the kitchen towards the side of the house where those French doors were that led out into the side yard, and those doors were still only secured by the nails her father had put into the ground. The lock her father had ordered had not come in yet. Kim found herself looking at these doors, feeling really uneasy about it. And then as she was looking at it, she could have sworn she saw the doors begin to push open. And she's looking at it even more closely. And then for sure, she sees the doors bow inward like someone is pushing on the top and the nails are stopping the bottom. And for a split second, she sees the clear silhouette of Dr. Ramsey. And she screams. It wakes up her sister and her brother, and she's pointing at the double doors. They all look. And once again, he pushes on those doors, exposing himself just for a second to the kids. So now all three kids have now seen this guy trying to force his way into their house. And so they scream and run right upstairs. They go into Kim's room, they shut the door, lock it, turn the lights off, and they go over to the window that's looking out to the front of their house. Now, Dr. Ramsey is on the side of the house, so they wouldn't be able to see him through this window, but they're just praying that he does not break through those doors and come in the house. They're hoping they'll see him as he exits the front of their house. And they're kind of keeping an eye out the window, just praying they see this guy leave their property and leave them alone, but they don't see him leave, and they don't hear any noise downstairs or outside. It's just total silence. And they're wondering, did he already get in the house? They decide they need to look for themselves. And so they leave Kim's room and they sneak down the hall to the side room, which was their brother's room, that overlooked the area where Dr. Ramsey would be. They go over to the window and they poke their heads up and look out the window downstairs. And sure enough, there's a man standing right in front of those French doors with his hands on them, kind of looking in, looking around. And at this point, the kids suck themselves down underneath the window so that he doesn't see them. And as they're crouched down, they hear him start banging on the door downstairs, at which point Kim's sister, who was there with her, just says, "What do you want?" The banging stops, and the man says, "I have a pizza. Come down and get it." Kim and her siblings didn't order a pizza, so they just yell out, "If you don't leave, we're going to call the cops." And then Kim pokes her head over the window and she looks down and she can clearly see it's Dr. Ramsey, who's now turned and he's running away from their house. Just a couple of minutes later, Kim's two older brothers return. They were out at a skating rink and they come back, they come inside, and Kim and her two younger siblings go up and tell them what happened. And immediately those two run out and start looking for him, but he's long gone by now. So they come back in, they shut all the doors, they lock everything, they shut the blinds. And they say, okay, all we can do is just get a knife out of the kitchen, each of us, and just be armed until our parents come back. And so they all grab a knife, except for the youngest brother, and they all retreated to their rooms and basically just waited for their parents to come home. An hour later, Kim's parents are still gone and all the kids are still in their rooms, and her younger brother gets hungry and he decides to go down to the kitchen to get a bowl of cereal. So he goes downstairs and he's getting his cereal together and he starts feeling like someone is watching him. And he's looking around and he knows all the curtains have been drawn and everything's locked and shut, and he's just psyching himself out. But he notices the French doors that are leading to the side of the house. Those have glass panes on them and there's nothing covering them. And so as he's getting his cereal together, he finds himself constantly looking over at this door. And finally he decides, okay, I'm going to put my cereal down and just go look out the glass, just make sure no one's there. And so he walks a little bit closer to these doors and he gets about, 5-6 feet away, and the glare from the lights above still make it impossible to look out this glass. And so he's kind of squinting his eyes, but he can't see anything. And so he steps forward and he puts his hands like this and he looks right out one of the panes of glass, and staring back at him is Dr. Ramsey, who's probably been there the whole time. And he's just standing there looking at him, and he freaks out. He screams for his brothers. And as soon as he turns back around, Dr. Ramsey has run away. He's gone. All of the siblings come pouring downstairs, knives in hand, and they're asking what's going on. And the youngest brother is trying to explain that he just saw Dr. Ramsey right on the other side of this door. And the older brothers go running outside. They're screaming for this guy. They're looking for him, but he's gone. And they all come back in the house and they don't know what to do. And so they all stay up together in the kitchen with their knives, with everything shut and locked, just waiting for their parents to come back. And shortly after, they hear their parents using their keys to come in the house. They come in and the kids explain what happened to their parents, and the parents feel horrible. And they're like, "I'm so sorry that we left. We should never have left you guys." But as horrible as this was for the family, when they call the police, they can't really do anything because he wasn't there now. Nobody got hurt. Nothing was taken. And they don't even know what this guy's name is. And so they just said, stay inside, keep everything locked, and let us know if he comes back. A couple of horrible weeks for this family goes by where they're living in constant fear. The parents are never away from their kids. The father had to take time off from work. It's just this very stressful time where they are totally prisoners in their own home. And after about 2 weeks of this, Kim is at school. She's at recess with her class outside, and she was playing on the playground when she looks out at the road and she sees Dr. Ramsey in his car parked, waving at her and yelling her name. And so Kim is horrified. She turns and runs to her teacher and she points at him and she says, "That guy's stalking our family. I have to go inside and tell my parents." They immediately took this very seriously. They took Kim inside to the principal's office and they called home to Kim's mom. And when she picks up, Kim's mom explains that she just got a call from the school office asking her to verify whether her husband was going to be picking up Kim from school early. And Kim's mom said, "No, he's not picking her up. There's no one picking her up early." And that's when they put it together that Dr. Ramsey must have been in touch with the school to try to convince them that he was Kim's father and he was here to pick her up. And that's why he was parked outside. Kim's mother is horrified because she's thinking to herself, if the school hadn't been diligent to confirm this, there's a chance they would have given her child to Dr. Ramsey. This proved to be kind of like the final straw. Even though there was a whole bunch of final straws along the way, this was the one that ultimately pushed Kim's father over the edge. That night, Kim was sleeping in bed when she woke up because she was thirsty, and she goes downstairs to the kitchen, and she's surprised to find her father is sitting at the kitchen table, the lights are off, and he's got a gun in front of him, and he looks totally disheveled and upset, and she knows right away that this is because of Dr. Ramsey. She's not thinking this is anything else, and so she walks over to the sink and just kind of ignores the fact that this is happening. She gets a sip of water, and then she sits down with her father and says, "Is everything okay?" And her father looks up and he just says, "No, I'm not okay. I'm tired of leaving the house and wondering if when I come home, my family's not going to be there anymore. I'm tired of not being able to protect my own kids. I'm tired of this. This has to end." Kim didn't know what to say, so she just sat there in silence with her father until he told her to go back to bed. Kim says after this night, they never heard from Dr. Ramsey again. It was like he vanished off the face of the earth. No more phone calls, no more drive-bys, no more anything. He was just gone. And while we don't know for sure what happened to Dr. Ramsey, I think it's safe to assume that Kim's father had something to do. In 1989, 22-year-old Eloise Lindsay was a fresh college graduate, and she was at a crossroads in her life because even though she just earned her degree, she really didn't know what she wanted to do with her life. And because she was an experienced backpacker, she thought a good way to kind of get her life together would be to go on a sort of retreat, go out into the woods, go out into nature, and kind of find herself. So she had planned this very detailed 43.3-mile hike along the Appalachian Trail, starting in South Carolina, where the first 7 days of the hike, she would be totally on her own, and then at the 7-day mark, she would meet up with a friend at a particular rendezvous point. Her friend would give her resupplies and would be her companion for the rest of the hike. When Eloise told her parents what her plans were, they were not concerned for her safety because she was an experienced backpacker. She had made trips like this before. And so they said, "Great, we'll see you when you get back." So on November 4th, Eloise sets out to begin her journey down the Appalachian Trail. And the first couple of days of her hike were great. The weather was beautiful, the scenery was amazing, and she had all this time to just kind of be by herself and look internal and think hard about what she wanted to do with her life. But on the third day, when she woke up, she was sleeping inside of a tent she had camped just off the trail. She woke up and she had this intense sense of dread. She couldn't really place where it was coming from, but she knew something was wrong. And she's kind of doing inventory of her life, like, what did I forget? Is there something that I'm just not thinking about right now? But she kind of pushes it aside mentally and thinks, okay, you know what? I'm just going to pack up my campsite here and get hiking, and I'm bound to, come up with what it is that's making me feel this way. So she gets out of her tent and she begins packing up her campsite, and she's looking out, kind of scanning the tree line, not because she was looking for anything, but just because she happened to be looking out. And she could have sworn that she saw a man standing, 30, 40 feet away behind a tree. And she kind of did a double take and was staring at him. It's, it's broad daylight, it's the morning, and they're near a trail. So it isn't like unbelievable that there might be someone near her at that very moment. But she kind of did a double take and she looked at them again, and this person was gone. And she stood there for a minute, just kind of looking in the direction of where she had seen this guy, wondering, is my mind playing tricks on me? Did I really see someone there? Why aren't they showing themselves again? If there was someone there, they clearly must have just been looking at me. Why aren't they, poking their heads out again to communicate with me in some way? We're out in the middle of nowhere. We should be talking to each other. But the guy never shows himself again. And so as she's standing there wondering what she should do, she isn't ready to yell out to this person because there's part of her that's a little bit nervous about yelling out to some stranger in the middle of the woods. But she starts to get this really intense feeling that she's being watched. And it feels an awful lot like the sense of dread she had while she was in the tent. And she's starting to wonder, are my instincts or is my sixth sense picking up that I'm being watched? Like there's some predator out there looking at me right now? And even though she has no way of knowing if that's actually true, She's alone in the middle of the woods, and even though she's experienced, she can't help but feel really vulnerable. And because this guy is just not showing himself again, she feels a little bit threatened. And so she begins to panic and she starts packing up all of her stuff as quickly as she can. And as soon as she can, she takes off down the trail away from that guy she saw in the woods. As she was walking down this trail, she couldn't help but think someone was right behind her. And she kept turning around to see if this person or whoever it was behind her, and no one was ever there. But this visceral feeling that she was being watched, that sense of dread she had, it just was not going away. And so she started walking faster and faster. Before long, she was running, and she's realizing that she's in a section of the Appalachian Trail that's very remote. She's not near civilization. She's not near her next rendezvous point. And so she's thinking to herself, I need to get off this trail. I need to get to a road. I need to get away from here as soon as I possibly can. And so her options were to continue on this trail for several miles, and it would probably take her until well into the night before she was going to reach civilization. Or she could take a shortcut because she believed there was a road that was running parallel to her trail, but it was way down the mountain. It would require leaving the trail and basically cutting through the wilderness to get down to this road. But she was pretty confident it was right down there. And because this threat of this person or thing following her was so intense for her, she decided to leave the trail. She couldn't stand the idea of having to spend another night out in the middle of the woods with this person stalking her. And so she walks off the trail and starts running down the mountain. It wasn't long before she started to hear audible sounds coming from what she believed to be this person that was following her. And she would turn around and there'd be no one there. And then she started to walk, trying to listen as she's walking, and she would hear footsteps far away from her, and she'd turn and there'd be nobody there, but she was certain someone was following her, someone was stalking her. And the sounds that were coming out of this person, this animal, whatever it was, they sounded like, a deep male voice, but you couldn't recognize if it was a language of some kind. It just sounded more like a grunt or a yell of some kind. And so her heart rate's elevated, she's panicking, and she's walking as fast as she can just through the middle of the wilderness, hoping she's walking towards this road. But after walking and running for miles into the middle of nowhere, she has not come to a road. It's now completely dark out, and she knows she's lost. And so she has to set up camp in the middle of nowhere, and she knows somewhere out in the middle of the woods is some person or something that is stalking me. And she's all alone. She has no way to contact anyone. She doesn't have a cell phone. It's 1989. And so she sets up her campsite and she gets in her tent. She zips it up and she lays there hoping she doesn't hear any sounds. And sure enough, within minutes of being inside of that tent, she starts hearing those audible sounds coming from somewhere in the forest. And she hears what sounds like heavy footsteps walking around the perimeter of her campsite. All night long, she hears this. But luckily, they don't come up right to her tent. So there's some separation between her and whatever is making these sounds. And then finally, the sun comes up. She is out of that tent, packs it up, and continues running in the direction she hopes is the road. And of course, all day long, she has that sense that someone is watching her. She's hearing footsteps coming from behind her. She would turn. She doesn't see anything. She would hear that audible grunting sound, that low voice coming from somewhere behind her. But again, she would never see whoever it was or whatever it was that was making the sound. And then again, the sun is starting to set and she has not found the road. She hasn't found a trail. And she's thinking to herself, I can't even backtrack because if I turn around and start walking backwards, I'm bound to run into this very thing I'm trying to escape. And so once again, she sets up her campsite in the middle of nowhere. She gets inside, and as soon as she's laying in her tent, she starts hearing those heavy footsteps somewhere out in the woods, kind of walking around the perimeter of her campsite. She's hearing that low audible sound that she can't quite place. And at some point she falls asleep. She gets up the next morning. She jumps out of her tent, packs it up, and starts running, hopefully in the direction that will bring her to civilization. A couple days later, when Eloise was supposed to meet her friend on the trail at the 7-day mark, and they were going to finish the hike together, well, Eloise doesn't show up. But after several hours, when Eloise did not show up, her friend left the trail and contacted authorities and filed a missing person report. And the police would launch this massive search for Eloise along the stretch of the Appalachian Trail where she had said she would be. And for the next 14 days, hundreds of police and volunteers and helicopters are scouring this area, and there's no sign of Eloise. And so after 14 days from the time her friend filed the missing person report, the police had to turn the search off, and they say, look, we can't find her. 2 days after the search was terminated, so 23 days after Eloise had initially set off for her trek through the Appalachian Trail, a hunter that was out in the middle of nowhere near the Appalachian Trail discovers Eloise perched up against a tree. She's totally emaciated, she's dehydrated, she's delirious, but she's alive. At first, she was terrified of the hunter because she believed the hunter was this person that had been following her. But when she realized he was there to help, she went with him. She was brought back and brought to a hospital, and she was checked out. And besides being dehydrated and, emaciated, she was okay. And she would detail in multiple interviews and in her official statement that she had been chased for the past almost 3 weeks in the middle of the woods, and she doesn't know who it was or why they were chasing her. And then interestingly, she said right before she was found, so a couple of days before this hunter finds her, this person, this thing, whatever it was that was following her, got so close to her a couple different times that she was so scared she ditched her backpack that contained all of her life-saving equipment, like her sleeping bag and her tent, and it had some food and water in there. She ditched that so she could be lighter, so she could run faster away from this thing that is chasing her in the woods. So you gotta figure, you gotta be at such a high level of fear that you're prepared to ditch the one thing you really require to survive out in the wilderness, which was her pack full of supplies. And then after she's ditched her pack and she's run for some distance, she's got no supplies, no food, no water, she stumbles across this tree in the middle of nowhere that wedged inside the trunk is a cache of donuts and pound cake. And so she takes the donuts and pound cake, and between that and the stream water she had found, that's what kept her alive for the last few days before she was found. Eloise says she has no idea what to make of her experience, and law enforcement were baffled by it as well. Some people think Eloise had a mental break, and she effectively made this whole situation up. That she really was lost in the woods, but no one was chasing her, and she was just kind of paranoid and running around the wilderness for a couple of weeks. Other people, including park rangers that worked that stretch of the Appalachian Trail, believe it's possible she could have been stalked by wild men, which are basically people that live out in the mountains that are effectively feral, that live off the land, and they've been known, according to local legend, they've been known to attack park rangers, and people that live out in that area have claimed to have seen these wild men, and they kind of match the description of what she was describing. But as of right now, there's no official explanation for what happened to her other than she got. In December of 1961, James McCormick Sr. was on vacation from his job as a fire inspector for the city of Portland, Oregon. And he was feeling bored, he was feeling kind of restless, and he decided he wanted to go do something fun with his 16-year-old son named James McCormick Jr. They settled on going hunting together as they were both avid outdoorsmen, and so they, along with their hunting dog, headed out to Larch Mountain on December 4th. Even though Larch Mountain was only 30 miles from the city, it was known as one of the most rugged and wild areas in the northwestern United States. And so the men arrive at Larch Mountain, they're excited, they hop out of the car, they put their gear on, and they begin hiking into the wilderness. Now, the weather forecasters had said it was probably going to be pretty cold. There might be some light snow in the area, but the weather should hold for their day trip out into the woods. And so they hadn't brought any equipment to stay out for multiple days. This was just going to be a full day event, but back at night. But after walking for several hours into the mountains, they started to notice the temperature was dropping rapidly. And then it started to rain, and then it started to snow, all in a very short period of time. And initially they decided they were going to gut it out and keep walking a little ways, but they decided, you know what, this is awful and our stuff's getting wet and it's going to get dark soon, so let's just turn around and go back. We can go hunting another day. But it had started snowing so quickly that when they turned around to start making their way back to their vehicle, the snow had covered over everything enough that it looked a little bit different. And they didn't have a GPS, they were using a map and compass, and they were not on a marked trail. They were just kind of walking around the mountains looking for a place to set up. And so they're walking back and they're making turns and they're starting to question where they are. And when they had walked for several hours in the direction they believed was back to the truck, well, they weren't anywhere near a road and they felt like they were in an area they didn't recognize, and they realized they were lost. At this point, it was snowing really hard and it was starting to get dark outside. And so the pair decided, you know what? We got to stay out for the night. We're not going to find our vehicle tonight. It's too dark and we don't know where we are. So let's camp out for the night and tomorrow we will find our vehicle. But remember, they didn't have any equipment to stay out for the night. All they had was their warm clothes, but but they didn't have a structure to protect them from the elements. And so they decided their best bet was to climb up into a tree, because at least that way they're off the ground, they'd protect themselves from predators potentially, and the branches of the tree would kind of protect them a little bit from the snow and from the freezing rain. So that night, James Sr., James Jr., and their dog, they huddle in this tree. It's a totally sleepless, miserable night as they're just destroyed by snow and freezing rain and wind. And then finally the sun comes up the next morning and there's a glimmer of hope, although it's still absolutely dumping snow on them. But they're thinking to themselves, this is going to make a heck of a story when we get back. And so they climb out of the tree, they stretch, they kind of, readjust themselves, and then they begin walking in a direction that they think is the direction towards their vehicle. And for several hours, they're just kind of walking, hoping they're going to run into this road, and they don't. And at some point they realize once again that they are in the same position they were in the day before. They don't know where they are. And now they've walked even farther, potentially in the wrong direction. And so they stop for a second, and James Sr. pulls out his map and he's trying to make sense of where they might be. He's looking around. He's trying to terrain associate to see if he can figure out if there's a specific way he should be going. When his son, who was a really tough kid, didn't complain about anything, he said to his dad, I'm feeling delirious. I feel like I can't think straight. And it's hard for me to stand even. I'm going to sit down. And his dad's looking at him, not concerned about this, because it was a pretty miserable night the night before. And so it makes sense he might be tired. But they had slept a full night's sleep the days leading up to this trip. They've only been out in the elements for one day. They do have warm clothes on. They do have food. They do have water. And so he figures his son will just sit down for a minute and then he'll get back up and be rejuvenated and they'll keep moving out. And so James Sr. continues looking at his map. He's looking around, kind of waiting for his son to say, okay, I'm ready to start moving again. But his son just continues to deteriorate. He's speaking in nonsense and he can't stand up. And this was the first time that James Sr. really started to feel concerned for their actual safety. Because even the night before, when they were up in the tree, even then, it just felt like it was this crazy thing that was happening to them and that everything would be fine. And even that morning when they got up and it was still snowing and they're still lost, he had that optimism, and so did his son. But now thinking, okay, we are potentially staring down another night out here, and we're going to eventually run out of food and water. Our clothes are starting to get wet. The temperatures are dropping below freezing. We don't have a tent. We don't have a shelter. And now something's wrong with my son, which is concerning in and of itself. But if he can't move, then we can't make progress towards getting out of the situation. And so James Sr., who was this really fit fireman, he said, okay, I'm going to pick you up and I'm going to carry you. And he picked his son up, fireman's carry, put him over his shoulders. And for 3 hours, James Sr. just continues to march around looking for the way out. And after 3 hours, when they had not gotten anywhere closer to a road or any civilization, and now it was dark out again, he collapses with his son and he puts his son down by a tree and he sits down next to him and he's totally defeated. And he's like, we got to get ready for another night. We got to get back up in a tree and we got to do this again. And so as they're sitting there kind of talking about how they're going to get James Jr. up into a tree for the night because, he's too weak to climb up himself, they both notice these very bright lights about 100 feet in front of them that look like headlights. And James Sr. is like, oh my goodness, what luck. There is a road that we just didn't see and there's a car that's parked right there. I'm going to go up and communicate with them and tell them that we are stuck out here and see if they can give us a ride. Stay right here. I'll be right back. And so James Sr. gets up and starts running towards these lights because these lights are their lifeline and he wants to get to them before they potentially pull away without realizing, there's some people that really could use some help here. And so as he's moving, 50, 60, 70 feet away from where his son and his hunting dog were, the lights just continue to go farther and farther away from him to the point where James Sr. stops. And he's looking at these lights thinking, are those headlights? Like, what are those lights? And at some point, the lights just kind of disappear into the forest and then they're gone. James Sr. looks around and he realizes there's no road over here. I'm in the middle of the woods. Like, what were those lights? And so he stands there for a minute thinking to himself, am I losing my grip on reality? Like, what's going on here? And he turns around and he starts running back to where his son and his dog were. And when he gets there, only his dog is there. His son is now gone. And what's going through James Sr.'s mind is how? Because he couldn't walk until now. And my son certainly wouldn't have lied to me and made me carry him all the way here. And there's enough light out that he could actually still see the footprints on the ground. And so he grabs his son's backpack that was left by the tree. He picks it up, he grabs his dog, and he starts yelling for his son and starts walking along the footprints that were left by presumably his son. And so he's walking along these footprints and he's yelling out for his son. He's not hearing anything. And this whole time he's thinking to himself, like, why would he even leave? Even if he could move, why would he leave? You know, we're obviously in this together. Like, what's going on with my son? And so he's walking. And after about 30 minutes of walking along these footprints, because the snow was coming down so heavy, the prints were getting harder and harder and harder to track because they were filling in with snow. And finally it got dark out, and then he really couldn't see the prints anymore. And now James Sr. is absolutely panicked. You know, this is a nightmare. Where's my son? What were those lights? Oh my gosh, it's going to be another night out here. And he just picks a random direction, and holding onto his son's stuff with his dog, he just starts running. The next day, James Sr. and his dog would stumble into this lodge that was about 6 miles away from where they had parked their car over at Larch Mountain. Now, that doesn't mean they moved 6 miles to get there. They probably zigged and zagged all over the mountain, and they covered much more than 6 miles, but it was a 6-mile shot to this lodge. They stumble inside, and it was just a miracle that he had found it. He basically had ran all night until he found a road, and he traced it up to this lodge. And he told the staff inside, my son is missing. We've been gone for 2 days now. He's out in the middle of the woods. He's hurt. Someone needs to go out there. And so very quickly, the police were called, and word spread to the firefighters in Portland, Oregon that, you know, the fire inspector's son is missing. And so 200 off-duty firefighters made their way up to the mountain as well to assist in this search. The paramedics wanted James Sr. to just go to the hospital and let the searchers do their job. But James Sr. was not about to leave his son, and he refused medical attention, and he went out with the first group of searchers. And somehow he was able to get them to the rough area that he was able to recognize as, you know, roughly where his son had been sitting when he went missing. They searched that area and very quickly found James Jr.'s glasses case, as well as his boots and his socks, but no James Jr. Later in the day, though, they would find James Jr. He was about 1,000 feet away from where his boots and his glasses case were found, at the bottom of this cliff, and he was deceased. Now, initially the thought was, well, you know, he must have gotten confused and walked away from where he had been told to sit and fell off this cliff. But they determined he did not die from the fall off this cliff. He had made his way down to that cliff and then died of exposure. So how was James Jr. able to suddenly be able to walk again? And once he had that skill back, why didn't he go to his dad? Why did he walk away from him? And why did he take his shoes and socks off to do that as well? And what were those lights that James Sr. saw in the middle of the woods? Because they weren't headlights. And it was only when he went to investigate them that suddenly James Jr. up and walks away. 2014, a young woman named Jen was sitting in her sister's living room, looking out their back window where her son and her 2 nephews were playing. And as she's watching them, one of her nephews, named Harrison, walked over to this tree and began peeling the bark off of the tree. And for Jen, this brought back a very strange childhood memory that she hadn't thought about in decades. And without meaning to actually say the words out loud, Jen kind of blurted out what was going through her head, which was, "So weird." And her mother, who was in the other room, heard her say that, and she yells into the room, "Hey Jen, is everything okay? What's so weird?" And Jen, feeling a little bit embarrassed that she just said that out loud and that her mom heard her, is quick to try to dismiss it by saying, "Oh no, sorry, it's nothing. I didn't mean to say that." But as she's trying to dismiss it, her mom had walked into the living room where Jen was and saw Jen was looking out the back window towards the boys. And so her mom walked right up next to Jen and goes, "What are the boys doing out there that's so weird? Are they doing something they shouldn't be doing?" And Jen's like, no, it has nothing to do with the kids. I just saw Harrison, who was doing something that reminded me of some weird thing that happened to me, and I blurted out my reaction to it. That's all. And Jen's mom looks at her and says, "Well, now you gotta tell me the memory because I'm totally intrigued." Jen says, "Okay, Mom, I'll tell you the story. I don't know if Frankie's mom ever told you this or not, but when I was 8 years old, I spoke to Frankie and he was doing some homework and he told me to come meet him outside of his house and that when he was done, we could meet up and go play together." And so I walked over to his house and I was standing across the street in front of that small group of trees that we called the pine cone forest, even though it was just a handful of trees, but we all called it that. Anyways, I was standing over there and I was just kind of mindlessly peeling the bark off of the tree. I don't even remember consciously deciding to do it. And so as I'm peeling the bark off the tree, watching Frankie's house, waiting for him to come outside, I noticed to my right, there's this guy walking through the forest towards me. And then I look at him, and I've never seen him before. And before he got even within 10 feet of me, I could smell cigarettes. He reeked of cigarettes. And his teeth were very yellow. He's missing a number of teeth. And I noticed right away when I looked at his hands, I don't know why I was looking at his hands, but I looked at his hands, and he had these pointy yellow fingernails that almost looked like he was intentionally growing them out to be long and jagged. And he comes walking up to me and stops completely in my personal space. And instead of looking at me, he looks at the spot on the tree where I had been peeling the bark off. And he's literally like 1 foot away from me, so close that I had to lean back because I didn't want to be rude and run away. So I'm leaning back to avoid being right next to this guy. And all I can smell is cigarette smoke. And he turns from the tree to me and he goes, "What do you think you're doing?" And I'm like this, and I'm like, "I'm waiting for my friend." And he says, "No, what are you doing to the tree?" And I remember looking at him and then the tree and saying, "Peeling the bark off?" And that's when he raised his hand up and pinched my arm with his nails, not with the pads of his fingers, but he was using his nails, and he's pinching down on my skin, and through gritted teeth, he says, "How would you like it if someone peeled your skin off?" I remember as he's pinching me, I was so terrified that I didn't do anything. I was like in a trance and just stood there looking at him, wondering what's about to happen. And then as luck would have it, Frankie's mom just happened to come outside and yelled, "Hey, come on inside, Frankie's done with his homework." And so that kind of broke me out of my trance. I pulled my arm away and I began running away from him across the street towards Frankie's house. And I turned around once, kind of expecting him to be chasing me, but he wasn't. He was still standing next to the tree that I had pulled the bark off of, except now he was watching me. And I ran up onto the porch and ran inside, and that was that. I remember wanting to tell you about it when I got home, but for some reason I didn't. And then days turned into weeks, turned into months, and before long it was just a distant memory, and I never really thought about it, and at some point did forget about it, until just now when I saw Harrison peeling the bark off of the tree, and it brought it back, and that's why you heard me say, "So weird." That was my reaction to it, because I'm wondering, who was that guy and what happened to him? Like, that's so creepy. After Jen told her mother this story, she was expecting her mom to be a little bit horrified by it, because it is a pretty startling story about her own child. But Jen's thinking it's been so long since this happened and nothing came of it that her mom would probably quickly move on from it. But Jen noticed her mom looked very concerned, and she turned to her and she goes, "Mom, this happened like 2 decades ago. Like, this is not a big deal." And her mom looks down for a second and then looks up, and she has this look of guilt on her face. And she says to her daughter, "Jen, I should have told you this when it happened, but you were so young, and I felt like it was going to ruin your childhood. And so I just didn't tell you, and it seemed like you forgot about it, but obviously you didn't, and so I guess you got to hear the full story now." Jen's confused at this point, and she says, "What are you talking about?" And her mother, who now looked really uncomfortable, she's touching her face, and she looks very anxious, she says to Jen, "It's time you learned who that man really was." Before Jen could ask any more questions, her mom just says, "Honey, just sit down and I will explain everything to you." So they sit down, and Jen's mom is still acting pretty uncomfortable. This is obviously a difficult subject for her. And she starts by saying, "Okay, so do you remember how in our neighborhood where you grew up, everybody seemed to know each other? It was a really tight community of people." And Jen's like, "Yeah, I remember that." And her mom was like, "Well, because of that, it made it really easy to spot people that were, outsiders that didn't live in the neighborhood. And so if a car came down the street and I didn't recognize it, I would find myself looking out the window and watching the car to see where it was going, because there's no reason to be in this neighborhood unless you're a visitor or you live here." And so I was in the habit of people watching anybody that showed up that I didn't recognize. And I know a bunch of the other mothers in the neighborhood did the same thing, one of them being Frankie's mom. Anyways, on the same day that creep came up to you and pinched your arm when you were 8 years old in 1995, well, that morning, Frankie's mom, Sonia, she happened to look out her front window and she saw a vehicle she didn't recognize. And it was a work van, a white work van. It didn't have windows in the back, and it was parked across the street near the pinecone forest. And so she assumed it must be a work truck, and whoever had brought it here was, working on one of the houses in the neighborhood. But where it was parked, it was not close to any one particular house. And there was lots of places you could have parked on the street. So it seemed odd, if you're going to be doing work on a house, that you wouldn't just park in front of the house. Like, why would you park, inconveniently farther away in front of this random forest? And so that got her thinking that something's up with this van. But she didn't think it was bad. She just was trying to make sense of it. And so all morning she found herself going to the window and looking out to see if someone was going to claim this van, but she never saw anybody go near it. She didn't see workers going in and out of it. She didn't see any activity that was related to the van. It was just this empty van parked randomly across the street. And by the afternoon, when still no one had claimed this vehicle, she was getting ready to call the police. So that same day, you and Frankie had spoken on the phone and planned to meet up at the Pinecone Forest after he was done with his homework. And he didn't tell his mom about these plans, and so she didn't know that you would be very close to this van. Had she have known that, she would have told you to not wait out there, but instead to come right inside and don't go near this van. So at some point in the afternoon, when Sonia's getting ready to call the police, and you were actually already over at the Pinecone Forest waiting for Frankie, Sonia's looking out the window and she sees the back 2 doors fly open, and that guy who pinched you jumps out of the back and starts running into the Pinecone Forest. And from where Sonia's looking, she can only see part of the forest. The other portion of it is to the right, that's out of her view through this window. And so she turns and runs in her house to the side window of her house, and she looks out at that section of the Pinecone Forest where this guy has run to, and she sees you standing in front of the tree, and she sees this guy sprint right up to you and sees him pinch you in the arm, and he's talking to you. And that's when she ran out onto the porch and yelled for you to come inside. And she would tell me later that when she did that, she tried to sound very natural. She was worried if she sounded like this was an emergency, not only would it frighten you, but it might trigger this stranger to grab you or take you, because now he's been made. You know, someone realizes he's a bad guy and he might take you. And so the whole time she's watching you, she was watching him to see if he was going to chase you. And so when you came inside, she did her best to be totally calm and told you to go play with Frankie. And as soon as you were out of the room, she ran around the house and locked all the doors, all the windows, and then called me. And we decided it made sense to call the police. Even though you were safely in the house, we didn't know who this guy was, and it seemed like he was intentionally targeting you, like he was waiting for you the whole time. And so Sonia calls the police, and a police cruiser was sent over to our neighborhood, and they quickly found the white van that matched the description. They pull up next to it and they walk to the driver's side, and sitting inside the car is a man that matches the description of what Sonia gave. And he's acting really weird. You know, he looked like he was on drugs, or maybe he was drunk, or something was wrong with him. Something was off about him. And so the officers had him step out of the car, and they search his car, and in the front 2 seats, there was nothing but, cigarette butts and trash. And there was a partitioned wall between the front 2 seats and the back workspace of the van. They went around to the back of the van, and they see this guy has screwed a latch onto the back of the 2 doors, right across the middle, and there's a padlock through it. So there's an additional lock on this back door. Clearly, he doesn't want anybody getting in the back of this thing. And so the police turn to this guy, and they're like, "We need to get in the back of your truck. Can you please open this?" And at first he was, making excuses why he couldn't open it, but finally he relented and pulled out a special keychain he was carrying that had 2 distinct keys on it. And he used one of them to undo the padlock. He opened that up, and then he swung open the doors and he backed up. And the police look inside, and they can't believe what they're looking at. Inside of this van, all over every surface in the back, were pictures of you taped to the walls, to the ground, to the back. I mean, everywhere you looked, there was a picture of you. And they weren't just recent pictures of you. There was at least a couple pictures of you when you were 6 years old, and you were 8 when he approached you. So we know he was following you for at least 2 years. Also in the back of the van were binoculars, as well as a camera that presumably he was using to take these pictures of you. But that's not even the worst part. After this guy got arrested, one of the officers pulled out that keychain that had the key to the padlock on the back of his van, and he noticed the other key on the keychain was not just a duplicate key to the same padlock. It was a different, unique key. And so the police go over to this guy and they show him the key, and they say, "What is this to?" And he says, "It's to my storage locker." And so the police track down a storage locker, and they go over there and they unlock the lock with the key. And they open the door, and what's inside is straight out of a nightmare. The entire storage locker, the ceiling, the floor, the walls, all of it was covered in clear plastic wrap. And behind the plastic wrap, you could see on the walls were hundreds more pictures of you. And in the middle of the storage locker was a dentist chair that had been anchored to the ground. Next to the dentist chair was this silver tray like you would see in a dentist's office, except on it were all these knives. And they were not surgical or medical knives. They were like meat cleavers and hunting knives, crude instruments. And then next to that on a table was an anatomy book where he had used printouts of you to bookmark different parts of the book that he was taking notes on and highlighting, all of which had to do with the female anatomy. In the back of the locker was a rotted mattress that was just sitting on the ground, and anchored in the back on the wall were chains with handcuffs extending off of them, and then next to the bed were dozens of empty 5-gallon drums. When the police showed us pictures of the inside of his van, we were very shaken up. It was just so awful to imagine someone taking advantage of you in that way, watching you. But when they showed us pictures of the chamber that he had created inside of his storage locker, that's just something I'll never get over. He clearly had plans for you. After hearing this story from her mother, Jen is a mixture of angry with her mom for not telling her sooner, but also sad, that her mom had to go through that with her child, because now Jen is a mother, and she can only imagine how horrible that must have been for her then and even still now. And so all Jen could think to do was give her mom a hug. After they embraced, Jen asked her mom, what happened to this guy? Where is he? Did he go to jail? And her mom told her that he had confessed to stalking Jen, and he confessed that everything they found in the storage locker in his van was his, and that he understood the implications, but he never gave his real motives for it or really what his intentions were. He was ultimately put into a high security mental institution for the criminally insane, and her mom said she has no idea if he's still alive or if he's been transferred, but that was the last she knew about him. And so Jen wound up doing some homework and figured out where he was being held, and she asked to have a meeting with him because she wanted to ask him to his face, what were you planning to do to me? I want to know why you did this. And he agreed to take this meeting, but the day before they were supposed to have it, he took his own life. And so Jen doesn't know if that was brought on by their impending meeting. It certainly seems likely, but unfortunately, that's it. She doesn't get any more answers, and it will end with a big question mark of... From 2002 to 2006, Cullen Finnerty was perhaps the most successful college quarterback in history, winning 3 national championships and being named the Division II Player of the Decade. He was also perhaps the toughest college quarterback in history. Most quarterbacks will spend their careers looking to avoid getting smashed by defenders. Not Cullen. Cullen was 6'2", 240 pounds, and he would tell his teammates that he wanted to get hit, and he would hit back. And his coaches hated it about him, but his teammates loved this about him. Cullen was also famous for playing through injuries. His junior year in college, he broke his collarbone, and he didn't tell anyone, and he played through an entire playoff series that he won. After college, Cullen's professional football career was not nearly as successful as his amateur one. He played briefly for 2 NFL football teams, the Baltimore Ravens and the Denver Broncos, but when he wasn't getting any playing time and he just could see the writing on the wall that this was not going to be a match, he was not going to make it in the NFL, he left for Europe to play in a European football league. But when his European football career started to sputter out as well around 2009, he came back to the United States, where he joined a very small-time indoor arena football league. And while Cullen's love of football was still there as much as it ever was, he knew at this point, playing at this low of a level, that his career was effectively over. Around the same time that Cullen was hanging up his football cleats, he would meet Jennifer, who would become his wife. She was an all-state volleyball player and in many ways was just as competitive and as athletic as Cullen was. They were kind of like a perfect match for each other. They married in 2010, and Cullen, this big man, big-time quarterback, was shaking and crying at the altar because he was so nervous and excited about marrying Jennifer. Because I think this was a really big turning point for him, where he was basically putting football in the past and starting this new life and building a family with Jennifer, and he was really excited about it. The newlywed couple moved into a house together in Michigan where they had 2 kids, and Cullen landed a good job in medical sales, and by all accounts, Cullen was just hitting his stride post-football. On Memorial Day weekend in 2013, Jennifer's family was planning this 3-day fishing trip along the Baldwin River in Michigan, and the Finnertys decided they would join them. And so Cullen and his wife and kids, they rented a cabin that was going to be near the campsite that Jennifer's family was staying at. And for the entire weekend, it was just this great fishing trip where everybody had a great time and the weather was beautiful. And on May 26th, so the last night of this 3-day fishing trip, Cullen, who had recently purchased this pontoon boat that they had used for this fishing trip, he wanted to just go out one more time on his boat, this boat that he was really proud of, and fish for another 30-45 minutes before ending the weekend. So Cullen put on his waders and his jacket, he grabbed his fishing pole, and he had his family drive him to the stairs that led down to the water where his pontoon boat was. Before he walked down the steps, he turned and told his family that he'd be out for about 30 to 45 minutes and that he wanted to be picked up at the next boat ramp down the way and that he would call when he needed a ride. 42 minutes later at 9:27 p.m., Jennifer receives a phone call from her husband, and she's expecting it to be the call where he says, okay, I'm ready to get picked up. But when she answers the phone, Cullen is frantic, and he's telling her that he's being followed by two men in the tree line, that he's out on the water on his pontoon, but there are two men in the tree line that he can't see, but he can hear them, and they've been following him for some time. And before Jennifer can even get a word out, Cullen says to her that he's going to beach the boat and take his clothes off. And then he hangs up. Jennifer immediately tries calling Cullen back repeatedly, but he's not picking up. And so she's left feeling totally confused about what her husband has just told her. But what stood out to her was how scared he sounded on the phone. And fear was not something she typically associated with Cullen. This beast of a man, this tough football player, he didn't get scared. So for him to be that scared sounding and to be describing people basically stalking him, she knew he was in serious trouble. So she calls 911 and she describes where he is in the Baldwin River, and the police take her report and say, we'll send someone out right away. After Jennifer got off the phone with police, she called her family and told them about this really strange phone call from Cullen and how she had just called the police and she didn't know what to do. And so her brother tried calling Cullen and Cullen answered. And when he did, Matt said, hey, Cullen, where are you? And Cullen would say, I don't know where I am, but there's these two guys that are still following me. And Matt would say, are you still on your boat? Are you on land? And all Cullen said is, it's getting pretty rough out here. And then he hung up. Afterwards, Matt would call Jen and he would tell her about this phone call with Cullen, and it really didn't add any clarity to the situation. And so Jen and her family decide the best thing they can do is go to the boat ramp where Cullen had said he wanted to be picked up in hopes that maybe he would make his way there and they would find him. So Jennifer and her family head out to this location and Cullen's not there. They get out, they're yelling for him. There's no sign of him, and shortly after, a police car would show up because this was one of the areas where Jennifer had said when she spoke to police that Cullen might be. And so the police officer gets out, they take an official statement from Jennifer, and at this point they file an official missing person report. Before the police began looking for Cullen, they reached out to his wireless service provider and they asked them to ping his cell phone from the tower. Any service provider has the ability to roughly triangulate the location of a cell phone based on the last few locations of the phone. The last 4 locations that the service provider pinged for Cullen were up to 4 miles apart from each other, which was bizarre in its own way because the idea that in a very rugged, rough area in a very short amount of time that Cullen had been moving 4, 5, 6, 7 miles just to get to these different points, that didn't really make sense. But also when they looked at these points on a map, it looked like each of them was either near a paved road or in order to get to them, you would have had to cross a paved road. And so they're thinking to themselves, why does he keep moving point to point if at any one of these locations he's near relative safety? But as strange as these 4 locations were, the police now had a really solid starting point. So they dispatched people to each of these points and they began combing along the river where he had last been seen. And within an hour, they discovered his boat. It was a little ways down from where he had been dropped off. It was missing an oar and it was basically beached on the side of the river. It wasn't clear if it had been intentionally beached, but Cullen wasn't in it. And when they searched around the area, they couldn't find any sign that Cullen was in the area. They were yelling for him. He wasn't yelling back. Interestingly, a man who owned property near where the pontoon boat was found reported to police hearing screaming or yelling coming from the area where the boat was found around the same time that Cullen went missing. But despite this piece of information, it didn't actually help them discover where Cullen actually went. For the next 48 hours, police and hundreds of people searched in the areas where his cell phone had pinged and along the river where his pontoon had been found, but there was no sign of him. Then, on the evening of May 28th, approximately 48 hours after Cullen had gone missing, they discovered his body. It was located less than a half mile away from a paved road, and it was situated in between those 4 points that the cell phone provider had given. He was laying completely face down with his right arm under his body and his left arm over his head, clutching some grass. When they rolled him over, he had some blood coming out of his nose, but besides that, there was no significant trauma anywhere on his body. Cullen appeared to be wearing all of his clothes. However, it was noted that the strap on his waders was really badly twisted. Now, if he had never taken his clothes off, that would have been something he would have fixed. It would have been very uncomfortable when he started this trip to go fishing. That would have been something he would have fixed. Now, he said to his wife on the phone that he was going to be taking his clothes off, which there was no explanation for that, but he clearly said that to his wife, and she reported that to police. And so some have speculated that between that phone call and finding him with the twisted strap on his waders, that indicates that perhaps his clothes did come off at some point over the past couple of days and were put back on again, either by him or by someone else. His cell phone had also been found in his front pocket, indicating that those cell phone pings had been his actual location. Initially, Cullen's autopsy was completely inconclusive. There was no trauma to his body. There was no obvious thing that killed him. But later on, it was determined he died of pneumonia caused by inhaling his own vomit. So we don't know how you get to a place where you're inhaling your own vomit, but I would imagine you're in a pretty panicked state of mind if that could happen to you. Many people believe Cullen's death was the result of a traumatic brain injury caused by all the years of playing football and getting hit in the head. And so that can lead to paranoia. And so perhaps this was a fit of paranoia. He got turned around. He got scared. He thought somebody was chasing him. And then, he vomits and inhales his vomit, and that ultimately kills him. And in 2011, Cullen had briefly shown signs of being a little bit paranoid when one day he thought someone was following him, and he actually went to a family member's house and said, "I think someone's following me," but he could never identify where this person was or who they were. But even if this was a fit of paranoia and no one was following him in the woods, well, why didn't he stop on the paved road every time he crossed it? Because that would have represented safety. I mean, in 2011, when he supposedly had another fit of paranoia, his instincts were to go to a family member and to seek help. And so you would think his instincts in this situation would be similar. He would seek help. He would seek safety. But he continuously left safety. He left the road. He left his boat. His boat was safety. Why did he leave his boat? And even if we turn this around and we say, no, it was not a fit of paranoia, that he was in fact being followed by someone or something in the woods, well, then why would that prompt him to call his wife and say, "I'm going to get out of the boat and take my clothes off," and then proceed to walk 4, 5, 6, 7 miles in a very short period of time, crossing over a paved road at least 1 or 2 times and not stopping, not signaling for help? That doesn't make sense either. And what was that screaming that resident heard coming from the area where the pontoon boat was found? Unfortunately, there are many questions in this case, and the vast majority of them. September 15th, 2010, a 55-year-old man named Greg Flanagan checked into the Elegante Hotel in Beaumont, Texas to start his work week. As a young man, Greg had worked as a chief engineer on ocean-going vessels, spending months out at sea. But in his middle age, he had reinvented himself as a landman. It was Greg's job to secure leases of mineral rights and land for drilling. Greg was slender and fit-looking despite the fact that he never exercised and he smoked constantly. He kept a close-cropped white beard and he had the leathered skin of a lifelong outdoorsman. Every Monday morning, Greg would make the 2-hour commute in his pickup truck from Lafayette, Louisiana, all the way to Beaumont, Texas, where his company would always rent him a room. The hotel itself was neither good nor bad, but to Greg, he didn't care. He just needed a bed and a TV. Once Greg walked inside, he had a bathroom immediately to his right, and then a little bit farther in was the main section of the hotel room, which was very basic. Straight ahead, there was a window that looked down onto a small pool that was lined with potted plants. And then in the main space was a queen-size bed tucked up against the right wall, and then on the left wall was a TV. Greg wheeled his one suitcase into the hotel room and he put it at the foot of the bed and he opened it up. He pulled out the shirts that he wanted to keep wrinkle-free for the week and he hung them in his closet. Then he pulled out his toiletries that were kept in a cloth bag with a hook and he hooked those onto a towel rack. Then he took off his very worn brown boots and his faded blue jeans and he slipped on some pajama pants. Anytime Greg stayed at the Elegante, he rarely left his room. There was a bar downstairs, but he wasn't a big drinker or socializer. He preferred to just have quiet nights alone in his room watching TV. So that night, Greg cranked the air conditioning to make sure it was as cold as it could get. He liked to sleep in a very cold room. And then he hopped on his bed and he put 2 big pillows behind his head and he rested up against the headboard. And then he took a towel and he laid it out next to him. And on the towel was his ashtray, his cigarettes, his lighter, his phone, the TV remote, and a candy bar. Then he picked up the TV remote, turned it on, flicked through the channels until he landed on one that was playing Iron Man 2, and he thought, good enough. Put the remote down, picked up his candy bar, opened it up, he ate a piece of his candy, and then he grabbed a cigarette, lit up a cigarette, and he began smoking. The following morning, Susie, Greg's wife, did not get a call from her husband, and he always called her every morning that he was gone. That was their routine, and this was a big break from their routine. And so she tried calling him, and his phone rang and rang and rang, and he never picked up. And so then she called his Beaumont office, and he didn't pick up. But after the second or third time she called, his coworkers picked up the phone, and they said, hey, Greg's not here. He hasn't come into work yet. And Susie felt concerned. She felt like something was wrong. And she said, do you guys mind just going to his hotel room and knocking on his door and making sure he's okay? And they said, sure, we'll go over there. So the two coworkers head over to the hotel. They knock on Greg's door. He doesn't answer. And so they go down and get the manager, who comes up and opens Greg's door, and right away they find Greg lying dead in the middle of his hotel room. The way Greg was positioned when they found him, it looked like he had fallen to his knees and then fallen again onto his face, and his left arm got kind of tucked underneath his body, and still in his two left fingers was a cigarette that had not fallen from his hand, that had burned down to the wick. The room was exceptionally warm, and Greg's skin was grayish blue. Immediately after seeing Greg, the two coworkers called 911. Shortly after the ambulance arrived at the hotel, Detective Scott Apple arrived in his cruiser. Apple was a short guy, very, very fit. He had silver hair that he spiked up. He looked 100% cop, and he worked basically 24/7. When he got up to room 348, there was no sign of a break-in, nothing had been disturbed inside of the room, and there was no blood or obvious wound on Greg, with the exception of a slight abrasion on his cheek when he came down and hit his face on the rug. He looked around the room and he found Greg's wallet that was sitting in the back pocket of his jeans, and there was hundreds of dollars in his wallet that had not been taken, so he ruled out robbery. He went out into the hall and he began interviewing the other occupants of the surrounding rooms, and no one had heard anything and no one had seen anything. He went back into the hotel room and he began looking around for drugs of any kind or any substance that Greg might have taken that could have contributed to his death, and there was nothing. No prescription pills, no alcohol, nothing. Later that day, after the family had been notified of Greg's passing, his grief-stricken wife, Susie, called Detective Apple, and she said, my husband did not take good care of himself. He had a terrible diet. He's been smoking like a chimney since he was a young teenager, and he never saw a doctor. And I always told him that if he wasn't careful, something like this was going to happen. I always worried that he might have a heart attack or something. So at this point, not only does Greg's family think he died of natural causes, Detective Apple also thinks the same thing. He's thinking about what he saw in the hotel room, and there's no sign of any foul play. It just looks like a guy whose lifestyle caught up to him. Greg's body was sent to Dr. Tommy Brown, who in Beaumont, Texas, he was like the medical examiner. He'd been doing this for years and years. Dr. Brown had read ahead that they believed Greg had died of a heart attack or something like that. And when his body was wheeled in front of him, there was nothing he saw right away that contradicted that theory. The only two marks that the doctor noted on the outside of Greg's body was the small abrasion on his face from where he landed on the rug, and then he also had another small abrasion on his crotch. But beyond that, the rest of his body was completely unblemished. When he looked inside of his body, it looked like someone had literally just crushed his insides. His torso was full of blood. Food from his intestines had been ripped outside. He had ribs broken, internal organs were lacerated, and there was a hole in his heart. Dr. Brown was really confused at what he was looking at, because the severity of Greg's internal injuries were more consistent with someone who had been in a severe car crash or who had had a really heavy object land on them. But Greg didn't have any significant external injuries that would support either of those two things happening to him. And he was found in the middle of a hotel room where there was nothing disturbed and no one had apparently seen or heard anything. And so Dr. Brown says, look, I don't have all the answers here, but this was not natural. This is a homicide. And my best guess is he was beaten to death. I know it doesn't really make sense because there's not any external injuries, but he suffered some significant trauma from somebody else, and that's what killed him. When Detective Apple got this report from the medical examiner, he was just as confused as Dr. Brown was, but his attention turned to, okay, well, if he's been murdered, who would want to murder him? And he began digging into Greg's background, and he found that he was universally liked. He was known for being incredibly courteous and polite. He kept to himself. He was in love with his wife, and his wife loved him back. There was no evidence of some scandal in the background. He was just this really nice, normal guy, and it didn't make any sense why anybody would want to kill him. After a few months of getting nowhere, and in reality, he hadn't really even gotten started because there wasn't any good starting point, The only thing he could find that was odd about the crime scene was that the room was particularly warm when they walked inside, which was not in keeping with how Greg would have kept the room. But that doesn't explain why his insides were crushed. And so he's gotten nowhere, and then he makes a discovery. He found in the hotel's maintenance logs on the night Greg died, he had been making popcorn in his microwave and managed to blow a fuse. And it wasn't just his power. Maybe Greg didn't know this, but he cut the power to both the room next to him on his right and on his left and below him. And so he calls down to the front desk, and a maintenance guy came up and he reset the breaker. This opened the door to two theories. The first theory is the maintenance guy, who did have a criminal record, when he came up to fix the breaker, he attacked Greg. But that was wildly speculative, and there was no evidence to suggest that the maintenance guy would do that, and so that was quickly ruled out. The other theory was Greg's neighbors in room 349 were these two electricians who were big partiers and drinkers, and so Detective Apple suggested that maybe when Greg accidentally cut the power to their room, they were really annoyed, and they went outside in the hall, and they saw Greg, and they somehow realized he was to blame for this, and in a drunken rage, they attacked him and killed him, and that's what killed Greg. And even though it was a stretch, it was the closest thing to a motive Detective Apple had found in anyone. And so Detective Apple put on a hidden camera, and he went and interviewed these two electricians that were still staying in room 349. And he said when he spoke to them, they were very forthcoming. They seemed very honest. They were appropriately curious about what happened to Greg. And all they said was, look, we had no interaction with him. We did hear him coughing when we came back from the bar. We were at the bar that night, but honestly, that's the extent of our interaction with him. The electricians offered up their cell phone numbers, their email addresses, and said, anything you need from us, we'd be happy to help. We're really sorry this happened. At this point, Detective Apple is back to square one. No one knows what happened to this guy. The one big lead he had, the maintenance records, proved to be a total dead end. And so unfortunately, this case went cold. 7 months after Greg's death, where there had been absolutely no traction on figuring out what happened to him, Susie, Greg's wife, decided she wanted to hire a private investigator. And her friend suggested she call Ken Brennan, who was a famous private detective who was well known for being able to solve really complex cases. And so on a whim, Susie calls Ken Brennan, not expecting to get through to him, thinking he's probably super busy and has other cases because he's on TV and he's this really famous guy. But he picked up the phone and he was like, hey, how can I help you? And Susie couldn't believe it. She had a chance to tell him about what happened to her husband, and Ken said he was really interested and that he would take on the case. Ken was a former Long Island cop, and he was a DEA special agent. He spoke with a really thick New York City accent, and he wore t-shirts that were a little bit too small to show off his muscles, and he usually had a big, gaudy gold chain on. Once Ken agreed to take on this case, he flew right to Lafayette, Louisiana, where Susie lived, and he sat down and he asked her a lot of really difficult questions about their marriage, about whether she thought he might be cheating on her, if he had like a secret life she didn't know about. And after feeling satisfied that all those avenues have been explored and were not going to lead to the answer, he said, okay, well, can you tell me anything about the crime scene that stood out to you? Is there anything about it that seems off? And Susie said, yeah, Greg always kept the air conditioning on very cold at night. He never slept in a room that wasn't freezing cold. And so I thought it was really odd when his coworkers discovered him that the air conditioning was off and it was really hot inside of the room. That's incredibly unlike Greg for his air conditioning to be off. Ken made a note of this, and then he left Lafayette and he went to Beaumont, Texas to meet up with Detective Apple. And Detective Apple and he actually got along really well. They agreed to work together on this case because Detective Apple feels like he's reached a dead end anyways. Apple brought Ken to the crime scene. He showed him the hotel room. And then afterwards, he turned over all of the documents he had on the case, from the autopsy report to the photographs to anything he'd collected over the 7 months he'd been working on it. So that night, Ken diligently looks through all of the documentation, all of the photos. And the next day, when he goes into Apple's office, he says to him, I think I figured it out. And Apple's like, oh, really? You figured it out one day after being here? And Ken's like, no, seriously, I think I figured it out. I have to confirm something with his wife, but I think I have a theory. And so Ken calls Susie right in front of Apple. And when Susie picks up, Ken's like, hey, did your husband ever smoke with his left hand or did he smoke with his right hand? And Susie said, oh no, he only smoked with his right hand. And Ken goes, thank you very much. He hangs up and he goes, Apple, I got it. And so Apple's like, okay, what's your theory? And Ken says, okay, So I spoke to Susie, and she told me it was very strange that his room was not air conditioned when they discovered his body, because Greg was known for always turning on the air conditioning to as cold as it can get, especially at night when he went to bed. And so when his power went out the night before, his air conditioning would have gone out. And so the maintenance guy comes up, turns the power back on, but it doesn't trigger the air conditioning to turn back on. The room is still cold from having been air conditioned all evening to that point. And so the TV is back on, and so perhaps Greg turns and just starts watching TV. Because the room feels air conditioned, he hasn't realized that he hasn't turned the air conditioning back on again. Now, this is Beaumont in the summer, so it's going to get really hot in his room really quickly. And as soon as it starts to warm up in there, he's going to realize, oh, I didn't turn the AC back on, and he would go over and turn it on again. And so because the air conditioning wasn't on, and we know that the power was restored at 8:30, then he must have died after the power was on, but before it got warm enough in the room for him to recognize he did not turn the AC on, which means he would have died somewhere between 8:30 and 9 p.m. at night. And so Apple's like, wow, that's pretty impressive, except that doesn't really help us figure out how he died or who killed him. And Ken puts his hand up and he says, I know, I'm just building the whole picture here. Okay, so we have him dying between 8:30 and 9, and I don't think he was beaten to death. I think a lot of people want that to be what killed him because it's kind of the only thing that might make sense, but I say it definitely doesn't make sense because of the cigarette. Now, we found that cigarette in his left hand, and I talked to his wife, and she said he only smokes in his right hand. And so what I think happened is the power came back on at about 8:30, which is what the report says. The TV turns back on. Greg doesn't turn the air conditioning back on. He sits on his bed. He's watching TV. He lights up a cigarette, and he's smoking with his right hand. And then something happens to him, which I'll get into my theories on that, and he jumps off the bed, and he starts making his way to the door to get help. And he transfers the cigarette from his right hand to his left hand so he can use his right hand to turn the doorknob and open the door to safety. But he doesn't make it. He falls to his knees and he falls to the ground, and his cigarette's still in his fingers, and he dies. And Apple's like, you know what? That's pretty good. It makes a lot of sense. But the crucial missing piece here is, well, what was the trauma he suffered that caused him to jump from his bed and run to the door and then ultimately die? Ken's like, I got a theory on that too, but I got to be in the hotel room to see if it's true. So Apple and Ken go back to the hotel room. When they get there, Ken goes inside and he starts walking around, looking at the ceiling, the wall, the ground. And then finally he stops when he's looking back towards the front door leading back into the hall. And he points at the wall and he says, there. And Apple looks at what he's pointing at, and it looks like there had been some patchwork on the wall in the same spot where the doorknob, when it swings open, would hit the wall. And so Apple's looking at it and he's like, that's just from the doorknob. And so Ken takes the door and he opens it all the way to where the doorknob is pressed against the wall, and it's to the right of this patchwork, meaning this patchwork is not connected to the doorknob. Apple was confused and was about to ask questions, and Ken was like on a roll, and he said, hold on, and he goes outside. He goes next door to room 349. They go inside, and Apple walks in the room and he's watching Ken do his work, and Ken's rubbing his hands all over the wall, and eventually he stops and he looks up at Apple and he takes his finger and he pushes on one spot in the wall as Apple is watching, and his finger goes right in. And what he pushed on was this little chunk of toothpaste that had been wedged in this little tiny hole in the wall, and he pushed it through. Apple brought in a crime scene investigations unit who carefully excavated both sides of this wall, and they shined a laser from 349 into Greg's room, and the trajectory of the laser going through this hole lined up perfectly with where Greg would have been sitting on the bed, smoking cigarettes, eating candy, watching a movie. So Ken and Apple go back to the medical examiner, Dr. Brown, and they say, look, you missed something because Greg got shot. And unfortunately, Greg's body had already been cremated, but they did have the pictures to look at from the autopsy. And sure enough, they find that little tiny laceration in his crotch was actually an entrance wound. And then when Dr. Brown pointed out, there was a hole in the heart, and it kind of lined up with the trajectory that bullet would have been traveling through his body. Dr. Brown realized he had made a mistake, and he changed the autopsy report to reflect a gunshot wound. Ken and Detective Apple re-interviewed one of the electricians that had been in room 349 that was in the room where the gunshot had originated from. His name was Lance. And when they brought him in, they said, this is totally routine. You know, it's been 7+ months since Greg's death. And what we're doing is any of our witnesses, we want them to sign a statement, basically attesting that this is what I saw or didn't see. And so they had prepared a statement that basically lined up with the first thing he had told police, which was, I didn't hear anything, I didn't see anything. And they said, is there anything you want to change about your story? Or is this exactly what you saw and heard? And Lance said, yeah, that's exactly, I don't know anything. I wish I knew more, I'm sorry. And like, all right, well then can you sign this document saying that you don't know anything and you didn't see anything? And he said, yeah. He signs the document, and then Ken's like, all right, gotcha, because we know a gunshot was fired from your room and that's what killed Greg. And so you need to tell me who shot the gun. Otherwise, I'm taking you to jail for submitting a false police report. At this point, Lance crumbles and the truth comes out. And he said that he and the other electrician in the room with him, whose name was Mueller, they were goofing around and drinking that night. And Mueller went out and got his pistol from his car and he brought it in and he was goofing around with it. And Lance was saying that he was trying to get him to stop doing that, but he kept goofing around with the gun. And at one point, he aimed the gun at Lance, and Lance kind of batted it away from him. He dropped the gun, it landed, and it went off. And they saw where the bullet hole was. They saw it was into Greg's room, and they both froze and they listened to see if anybody had reacted to this gunshot. And he said they didn't hear anything for a long time, and that made them believe that no one was in the other room, that no one was in Greg's room, and that they were in the clear. And so they left and went to the bar. They didn't even think to check on whoever was in that room. And when they came back, they said they heard Greg coughing in his room, and that further confirmed that he must not have been in there when they fired the shot, and he's totally fine and they are totally in the clear. The next day, Lance said when they saw his body being taken out, at first they did think, oh my goodness, this is us. We did this. But they overheard Detective Apple walking around interviewing people saying out loud that, yeah, we think this is natural causes. Yep, looks like a heart attack. This is probably nothing. I'm sure it's nothing. And they were like, oh, phew, it's not us. And so they actually believed it was just a coincidence that on the same day they're firing a rogue bullet into Greg's room, that Greg had a heart attack and died separately. But Lance would say that somewhere in the back of both of their minds, they knew they probably had something to do with it. And so they covered their tracks and they put toothpaste in the wall to cover up the hole, and they hid the gun, and they intentionally kept information from the police. And so ultimately Mueller, the owner of the gun, the one who really instigated that night, waving the gun around, and the one who actually dropped the gun, he was charged with manslaughter and was given 10 years in prison. On June 7th, 1951, two families from Santa Fe, New Mexico met up at the Santa Fe ski basin to have a picnic together and to enjoy the mountain air. During the summer months when there's no snow on the ground, the Santa Fe ski basin is a very popular location for hikers because the terrain is very rugged, and if you get up to the top of the basin, there's these incredible views overlooking the valley. But on this day, the two families decided they wanted to have a picnic at the base of the basin, basically looking up the mountain. As the parents were setting up the picnic site, the kids started playing together. And that was Larry and Janet McGee, who were brother and sister, aged 7 and 5 respectively, and Stephen Cross, who was 3 years old. After they finished setting up their picnic site, they look around and realize the kids are gone. And they're thinking, we just saw them like 2 minutes ago, so they can't have gone very far. And so they start looking around for their kids, and they can't find them. They're yelling out for them, and they're starting to get a little bit more worried. And they start branching out farther and farther, and they realize the only other place they could have gone is up into the woods, which are very steep and very rugged. So they're thinking, well, they can't have gone into the mountains. That would be impossible for these young kids to get very far, and they aren't responding to our calls. It's possible they could have been abducted. And so one of the parents ran down to the main building of the actual ski resort where they kept a staff member in there during the summer months. and they were able to get inside and use a phone, and they called authorities. So the police come out and they set up these huge spotlights that are aimed up at the mountain. And so the idea was, if the kids did get up into the mountain somehow, they would see these lights and hopefully walk down to them. After they set up the spotlights, the police began combing the side of the mountain in hopes that the kids were not abducted. But despite the spotlights and hundreds of searchers and people yelling out for these kids, they never heard back from the kids. They didn't find them. And so all night they're looking for them, and they're realizing that there's a pretty good chance they're probably not here. And that means they probably were abducted. And so by the following afternoon, things were really starting to look grim. There was no sign of these kids anywhere. And that's when a searcher who was way outside of the primary search area, they were about 3.5 miles away, thousands of feet up in elevation. They're up there and they're looking around and they're getting ready to leave when they see something out of the corner of their eye that looks like a person. They turn around and one of the kids is poking their head up from behind a log. And the searchers run over to them, and sure enough, the 3 kids were actually inside of this downed log, and they were all okay. As the searchers are picking them up and calling this in, they're thinking to themselves, how in the world did these kids get so far away? Once the children were brought back down to the search headquarters and were reunited with their parents and were checked out by a doctor who said, yep, they're a little dehydrated, but they're okay. After all that was done, the police asked them the question that everybody was thinking: how did you get where you were found? And Larry, the oldest of the group, he was 7 years old. It took him a minute, but eventually he said, they were playing around the picnic area and they went just barely into the tree line when all of a sudden a bear came out from behind a tree and began chasing them. And the 3 of them ran 3.5 miles up a mountain to find this log, which they jumped inside of, and they hid inside of this log from this bear, which apparently was patrolling the area looking for them. And in addition to this bear that was apparently walking around the area looking for them, Larry said they were especially scared of the gorilla that was walking around the area looking for them as well. Now, it's easy to discount Larry and the kid's story because you could say, okay, well, the gorilla they saw was actually just a searcher looking for them. Except there was no one in that area looking for the kids near that log until right before they were found. It was kind of like a last-ditch effort to push outside the boundaries of the main search area. It was just kind of a miracle they actually located them. And Larry and the kids were saying this gorilla and this bear were looking for them on the first day and first night they were out there. So there were no searchers out there at that time. As for the bear, there have been bear sightings in the Santa Fe ski basin, although it is fairly rare. But if it was a bear that was chasing these kids, it would have caught them. A bear is not gonna not be able to catch 3 small children running uphill. So either there wasn't a bear, or it was some other animal that might have resembled a bear. But what type of an animal would chase 3 small children who are very vulnerable 3.5 miles up a mountain only to abandon them? But even if we say, you know what, there's no way the bear and the gorilla had anything to do with this. This is just kids who got lost and they wound up in the woods and they were found, and that's it. Fine. But I have a 3-year-old and a 4-year-old, and I can tell you right now, there's no way they could cover a 3.5 mile distance uphill in really rugged mountainous terrain in a 24-hour cycle. There's no way. Without help, that's not possible. I would say the only caveat to that would be if my children were fearful for their lives, in which case adrenaline would kick in, and they probably could cover that distance in a 24-hour period. That certainly lends credibility to the idea that Larry, Janet, and Steve were in fact running for their lives, and they had that adrenaline kick, and that's how they were able to cover that distance. But were they really running from a bear or a gorilla? We don't know, and there's been no further investigation into this case, and I think that's because the kids were found alive. The parents, the police, Jack Churchill graduated from one of the UK's most prestigious military academies called Sandhurst, thus becoming an army officer. His first assignment was to an infantry unit stationed in Burma, but when he got there, it was peacetime, so Jack didn't have much to do. But instead of just sitting around all day, Jack did what any other restless young military officer would do, and he mastered the bagpipes, despite being 0% Scottish. He also took a trip across the entire Indian subcontinent on his motorcycle, almost entirely on unpaved roads. But in 1936, despite these incredible side hobbies, he just wasn't really that interested in being a part of the military when there wasn't anything going on, and so he decided to get out. He moved to Nairobi, Kenya, where he became a newspaper editor / male model / movie extra. During his off time, he still took his bagpiping very seriously, placing second in a prominent piping competition in 1938. He also picked up another hobby, archery, and he became so good at it so quickly that he was chosen by England to represent them in the Archery World Championships in 1939. Later that same year, when World War II broke out, Jack decided now's a good time to get back into the army. So he rejoined the army and he was promptly sent to France to help defend their borders against a potential Nazi invasion. But shortly after Jack arrived, Hitler was able to push through those defenses and he launched a brutal blitzkrieg campaign against the Allies in France. Blitzkrieg is a military tactic that's basically an all-out attack all at once with everything you got. So planes, tanks, artillery, infantry, you just send all of it in an attempt to overwhelm your enemy before you run out of resources. And in this case, Hitler's blitzkrieg was successful. In just 6 weeks, they not only invaded France, they conquered it. But during that 6-week battle for France that the Allies ultimately lost, Jack made a name for himself by employing 2 particular weapons that nobody else in World War II was using. He is the only one who used these weapons for the entirety of World War II. Jack and 2 other infantrymen were up on this hill overlooking this town that was full of Nazis, and at some point 5 Nazis come running out to the edge of this town and they duck behind a wall that's about 30 meters away from Jack. And one of these Nazis stands up and quickly crumples to the ground. And his 4 Nazi comrades look to see what happened to him, and they see a dead man on the ground with the back end of an arrow jutting out of his chest. And that arrow was fired by none other than Jack Churchill. Because for the duration of World War II, he didn't carry a gun. He didn't need a gun. Instead, he carried a bow and arrow and a long broadsword. Although periodically he would scoop the weapons up off of dead enemy soldiers, and he would fire those. When asked why he didn't just carry a gun in the first place, he responded, "Any officer that goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed." From then on, he became Mad Jack, and his peers loved him. But his leadership hated him. They said he was setting a terrible example, that no one should be running around with a sword and a bow and arrow. But he was so effective, they let him continue. Throughout the brutal 6-week battle for France, Jack would lead dozens of these small raids against the Nazis, and he would just pick them off one by one with his bow and arrow and with his sword. And in one particular raid, he got shot through the neck, but he was so nonchalant about it that when he got back to base, someone was like, "Hey, Jack, you're bleeding." And he was like, "Oh, yeah, I am." They were like, "Well, what happened?" He's like, machine gun. After the Allies finally lost this battle for France and were forced to evacuate, they found a diary from one of the British soldiers, and in it he talks about the one thing that motivated him and the other troops around him, and that was the sight of Mad Jack running hither and thither with his bow and arrow and his broadsword. For his bravery in France, Jack was awarded the Military Cross. After leaving France, Jack heard about this new unit, the Commandos, that was being stood up to aggressively sabotage Nazi operations, and they were looking for volunteers. And Jack didn't know much about what they were going to do, but they promised combat, and so he was all for it, and he volunteered. The commando unit would go on to become the famous British Special Forces, and the training they put Jack and the other volunteers through was absolutely brutal. And Jack just loved it. He loved being in the commandos. After graduation in 1941, Jack was put in command of a commando unit that was tasked with going to this Norwegian town of Vågsøy and taking down a Nazi garrison there. And so they loaded up into their amphibious landing craft, and Jack's got his kilt on, and he's got his bagpipes, and he plays the bagpipes on the entire transit over to Vågsøy to pump up the commandos. And then Jack's landing craft was the first to reach the shores, and when its ramp came down, Jack was the first off, and he just kept playing his bagpipes, despite the fact that the Nazis now see them, and they're shooting at them. So rounds are impacting around him as he's blaring his bagpipes, and only when he finished his song did he shoulder his bagpipes, pull out a grenade. He saw some Nazis running along the ridgeline. He throws a grenade at them, then pulls out his sword and runs into battle. In just a few hours, the Nazi garrison had fallen, and Jack was awarded his second Military Cross. During the Italian amphibious landings in 1943, Jack again was in charge of a commando unit, and they were tasked with capturing a Nazi observation post that was in this town just outside of Salerno. It was well defended and fortified, and Jack and his men were outnumbered 20-1. So Jack came up with a genius plan. Instead of using stealth tactics, he broke his small team into 6 different groups, and he placed them all around the outside of this town. And it was nighttime, so the Nazis did not see them setting up. And then on Jack's call, he had them all yell out at the exact same time, "Commando!" And the Nazis in the town were so caught off guard by all this yelling coming from all around them, they assumed a huge force is coming to take over this town. And so they went on the defensive. And so after their big war cry, Jack and his group are the first to charge down into this town, and Jack and one other guy would actually splinter off, and they would discover this big group of Nazis that were setting up their mortars. And so Jack and this guy sneak up behind one of them, and Jack grabs him from behind, holds this sword to his throat, and orders him to tell the rest of the team to surrender. And so the rest of the team, who vastly outnumber Jack and the other guy, they turn around and they see this lunatic wearing a kilt, wielding a sword. He's got bagpipes slung over his shoulder along with a bow and arrow. And they're like, okay, we give up. Shortly after, the rest of the Nazis in this town would surrender to Jack and his men, and for his actions, Jack would be awarded the Distinguished Service Order. In 1944, Jack was in Yugoslavia with the commandos trying to capture a strategically valuable location called Point 62. And when every man in his team was either killed or severely wounded, and when Jack had run out of arrows, instead of surrendering, he pulled out his bagpipes and started playing until a grenade detonated behind him, knocking him unconscious. The Nazis captured him and sent him to Berlin to be interrogated because they believed, because of his last name, Churchill, that he was connected to or related to the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. He wasn't, not at all, so they ordered Jack to be sent to a concentration camp. On his way out of Berlin, Jack secretly flicked a lit cigarette butt into one of his interrogator's offices, and he lit it on fire, but nobody knew it was him. And so Jack arrives at this concentration camp, and he's only there for a couple of months before he and another British military officer managed to escape by crawling underneath one of the barbed wire fences. They had slowly burrowed a tunnel without anybody noticing, and then they jumped down into this abandoned drainage pipe, and they crawled out to freedom that way. But their freedom would be short-lived because they only made it a couple of miles before they were recaptured by the Nazis. And so they were ordered to go to another concentration camp that was considered much more secure. But after only having been at this new concentration camp for less than a year, once again, Jack was able to escape. This time it was because there was a power outage at the camp, and Jack just put his shovel down and casually walked out the front gates, and nobody noticed. He walked 150 miles in the treacherous terrain of the Alps, surviving on vegetables he had stolen from people's gardens, and then finally, 8 days later, he came across a United States Armored Division, and they took him in and reconnected him with British troops, and then he was ultimately sent back to England. And while Jack was free, he was very frustrated that the war in Europe was effectively over, and he had missed most of it. And so he requested a transfer to go out to Burma to fight against the Japanese in the Pacific Theater, but as soon as he got there, the Americans had just dropped the atomic bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, Japan, abruptly ending World War II. And when Jack heard about this, he was so disappointed he would not get to do any more fighting. He was quoted as saying, if it wasn't for those Yanks, we could have kept this war going for another 10 years. Even though the war was over, Jack desperately wanted to get into combat at least one more time, and so he went to jump school and qualified as a parachutist at the age of 40, and with this new qualification, he was assigned to a light infantry unit, and they were deployed to Palestine to train their army how to better fight the Arab forces. And while he was there, he gained even more fame when he defended a Jewish medical convoy from an Arab ambush. And he did this all while wearing a kilt. Another time, he and 12 of his men helped evacuate 700 people from a Jewish hospital that was under attack from Arab forces. After Palestine, Jack came back to England and eventually retired from the army, and then begrudgingly took a desk job within the Ministry of Defense. And every day on his commute home on the train, he would take his briefcase and throw it out the window as they were moving. What he had figured out was if he threw it at the exact right moment, it would land in the backyard of his house, and he wouldn't need to carry his briefcase from the station to his house. But he didn't explain that to any of the other passengers on the train. They just figured there's some crazy guy who keeps throwing his briefcases out the window. In his retirement, he also became an extremely talented surfer. And at one point, he wanted to surf the Severn Bore, which is this huge wave in southwestern England that nobody else had surfed before. And locals that were familiar with this treacherous wave, they cautioned him and said, you really shouldn't do this. And he looked at them and he just said, I'll be all right. And then he proceeded to be the first person ever to successfully ride that wave. Jack would ultimately die in 1996. He was 89 years old. In 1990, 46-year-old Alex Kirstich was a marine biology high school teacher by day and a documentary filmmaker by night. In July of that year, he and 3 of his friends were in Mexico working on a documentary about sea life in the Gulf of California. They had already shot a bunch of footage during the daytime, and now they needed to go out and get some nighttime footage as well. On the evening of the 25th, Alex and his 3 friends boarded a 70-foot research vessel with all of their diving and camera equipment. They waited until just before sunset to leave the harbor, and then it was a 30-minute transit to this area just north of La Paz that they had been told was very active at night. Once the ship was stopped, they threw their anchor down and then turned on these bright spotlights and aimed them into the water. And then one of the ship's crew members put a big piece of tuna onto his fishing rod and then cast it out into the water to try to lure some animals to the area. A few moments later, a black mass suddenly came up to the surface, ripped the tuna from the line, and then vanished as quickly as it appeared. Alex and his 3 friends didn't get a good look at it. They saw it happen, but they had no idea what it was. So they told the ship crew member to put another piece of tuna on the line, throw it out there, and see if they can get a better look at this thing. And so more tuna was put on the rod, it was cast out, and then seconds later, a black mass rushed up to the surface, grabbed the tuna, and then went back down again. But this time, with Alex and the others looking really intently at it, they picked up what looked like a red and white flash, like a strobe light on the skin of this creature as it descended down below. And they looked at each other and they thought, could it be? And so another piece of tuna was put on the fishing rod, they cast it out into the water, and this time, before anything could come up and take it, deep down below, they see a flash of red and white all over the place, like a bunch of strobe lights going off. And then dozens of these creatures rocketed to the surface, fought over this tuna, and then descended back down into the deep water. And so now the men look at each other and they're grinning because they know the red and white flashing they are seeing is a trademark of a very rare creature. It's their skin changing colors. It's how they communicate with each other. And this creature is so rare that at this time, no one had actually filmed it alive. There was only footage of it dead after it washed up on shore. And so suddenly Alex and his team are thinking, man, our documentary is about to become legendary if we can just get in there and get the footage. And so the men eagerly put on their dive equipment, got their cameras, and prepared to enter the water. Had they consulted with anyone who studied this rare creature, they would have been told that getting in the water with them was a horrible idea and could easily get them killed. These rare creatures are called Humboldt squids, and they are 8-foot long apex predators that live in the deepest parts of the ocean. Because they almost never come up to the shallow waters, we know very little about them. What we do know is that, like all other squids, they have 8 arms along with 2 long tentacles that have all these suckers on it, and inside of the suckers are these teeth, these little daggers that they use to latch onto their prey, and then they pull their prey in towards their center, and at their center is this opening. It's their mouth, and it's called a beak, and it literally looks like a bird's beak. It's this hard thing that sits there and opens and shuts, and they use it to bite into their prey. And then inside of their beak is their tongue, and on their tongue are hundreds of sharp little daggers like more teeth that they also use to shred their prey. Typically, these jumbo squid will sneak underneath their prey and then suddenly shoot up, grab them with their 2 tentacles, and then drag them down to the deeper water where they feel safe. And then they begin the horrifyingly slow process of eating their prey alive because they have a gag reflex that prevents them from eating quickly. Humboldt squids are very intelligent, they're very social, and they're very aggressive towards humans, especially when they are in a large group or when they are eating. But of course, Alex and his 3 friends are not thinking about this. They're just eager to get into those jumbo squid infested waters and get this footage. And so they give each other the final okays. They're ready. Their equipment's good to go. And they slip off the side of the boat into the water. Once they were in the water, they sank down to 30 feet, at which point they spread out around the squid that were still darting up to the edge of the boat to try to get more tuna. After a few minutes of Alex and his buddies taking this great footage of these squids, a 14-foot shark suddenly comes into the mix and tries to eat the tuna off the side of the boat. But ironically, on its way out after not getting any tuna, the shark got its tail fins stuck on the actual hook and then became bait for the Humboldt squids. And seconds later, these squids began ripping the shark apart. And so Alex and his 3 friends decided to move closer to the drama to get some great footage. As Alex is right up next to this drama unfolding, he feels himself suddenly sinking in the water. And he's kind of fixated on getting this shot, so he's not really worried about why he's sinking. He's thinking maybe my buoyancy compensator waders off. Maybe my weights are too heavy. But when he looks down, he realizes in horror, a Humboldt squid has wrapped one of its tentacles around his right swim fin. And so he instinctively begins kicking the squid's tentacle with his left leg. He gets it to release him. And in a panic, Alex begins swimming back up towards the surface. But he's still 40 feet away at this point from the boat. And at this point, the other squid had been alerted to Alex as now being considered prey. And so as Alex is going up, from behind, another squid comes up and wraps its tentacle around his neck. And his neck was the only area on his body that was not protected by his neoprene wetsuit. And so the daggers inside of these suckers on this tentacle dug into his neck, all around his neck. So his neck's being cut into and he's being strangled and being pulled down by this squid. And so Alex begins punching and squeezing and pulling on this tentacle, fighting for his life. And he manages to get this squid, the second one, also to release him. But by now, he's been pulled down to 50 feet. He's got a ways to go to get back to the boat. And the other squid are all coming over. They're converging on him because they're all communicating that here's our prey, here's our other meal. And so Alex tries to swim as fast as he can back to the boat, but he only made it a few feet before another Humboldt squid darted up and came right up to his face, wrapped both tentacles around his entire head, blinding him, and he immediately felt the beak pressed up against his face, and it was opening and closing, trying to bite him, but it was biting down on his dive mask that was basically saving him from having his skull crushed by this squid. The squid became frustrated because it's not digging into Alex's flesh, and so it readjusted its grip on him by sliding down to his midsection, where immediately it begins pulling him down violently in these pulsing bursts. And so all Alex starts doing is punching and hitting and doing everything he can to get this thing off of him. And then for some reason, it does release him. Maybe it was just so frustrated that it could not puncture into him. And so Alex is now down to about 60 feet, and he starts swimming as fast as he can with all these squids all around him, but for some reason, none of them attacked him. And so Alex swims up to the boat, and before he actually gets on board, he looks down back into the water, and there's just dozens of these squids that are flashing red and white at each other, just kind of hovering in the water, not making any move towards him. It was like they were just watching him. Alex sprinted up that ladder, got into the boat, and shortly after, his three friends came out of the water as well. They were unharmed. Alex had deep cuts all around his neck from where the tentacles had driven their teeth into his throat. But besides that, he was physically okay. Mentally, he was a train wreck and was very traumatized from this event, as you could imagine. Today, his encounter with the jumbo squids is a thing of legend in the diving community. In 2010, Jan Maccabee was living with her husband Bruce in a town called Lima, Ohio, which is approximately 80 miles southwest of Lake Erie. While Jan had built a successful career as a booking agent for musicians, bands, and entertainers, her real passion was deer hunting. So on September 29th of that year, right after deer hunting season had opened in Ohio, Jan decided to go out on a hunt. That morning had been cold and damp and gray, but by that afternoon, when Jan was getting ready to go, the temperatures had risen and the sun had come out. Jan's preferred method of hunting was to sit and watch from a tree stand, which is a ladder that you put in the woods that sits about 15 feet high. She would sit up there with her bow and arrow and wait to take a shot when a deer came by. Around 5 p.m. that day, she told Bruce she was leaving, and she made it to her tree stand by about 5:30. The forest she was going to be hunting in was one she was very familiar with, and it was not very remote. There were a couple houses just outside the woods, there were some agricultural areas, and her nephew actually went to high school just a mile north of these woods. But from the tree stand where she was sitting, all she could see around her was trees. Shortly after Jan sat down, she started texting with one of her friends on her BlackBerry, and periodically she'd poke her head up and look for deer. There weren't any, and then she'd go back to texting. The whole time this is happening, Jan can hear birds and crickets and squirrels and all the sounds of the forest all around her. A little after 6 p.m., her texting conversation with her friend reached a natural conclusion, and so she went back to just kind of sitting in the tree stand looking around. By about 6:20 p.m., she still hadn't seen any deer, and she was starting to get bored, so she decided she would take a selfie. She picked up her BlackBerry, she took the selfie, and as soon as she was done, she became aware that the forest had suddenly gone completely quiet. No more squirrels, no more birds, no more crickets, just complete silence. And she knew as a hunter, the only time this happened was when a large predator was in the area and all the other animals went quiet. But Jan would later say there was just something different about this silence. It was so sudden and so complete that it scared her. And she wound up sending another text message to that friend she'd been texting earlier that said, "The woods just went completely silent. very odd. As soon as Jan hit send on that text message and lowered her phone, she immediately became aware of something about 20 feet away in the tree that was right across from her, and she said it was the most unusual and terrifying thing she had ever seen. Moving left to right through the branches was this thing that she described as like a visual distortion. She said it was like looking across pavement on a really hot day and seeing that mirage, except this one looked like it was alive, like it had mass, like it was a see-through person that had been wrapped in saran wrap. And so Jan thinks it's a floater in her eyes, and so she rubs her eyes, and when she looks up, this thing has now moved down a branch closer to her and has stopped, like it's perched on the branch, staring at her, and Jan's horrified, but she knows she wants to document it, so she grabs her phone and she raises it up and she takes a picture on her BlackBerry right as this thing kind of disappears behind the tree and vanishes. Just seconds after this thing disappeared, all the sounds in the forest came back. The birds, the squirrels, the crickets, it was all back to normal, but Jan was really shaken up because she just could not make sense of what she just saw. So she just continued to stare in the general direction of where this thing was for several minutes until finally she felt like it was safe again, at which point she brought her phone up to look at the picture she had taken. When she looked at it, it looked like a blurry mess, and so she thought, oh, I blew it, I put my hand over it, or my hair got in the way of it, or something. But at the same time, she's thinking to herself, but my hair didn't get in the way of it. And I very clearly held it out in front of me and know that I was looking at my phone when I took it and I had a clear shot of this thing. So I don't really understand how this photo got so messed up. But after looking at the picture for a little while, she started to kind of laugh at herself. You know, the idea that she'd just seen a saran wrap person running through the treetops. You know, she just felt like that didn't happen. It must have been in my head. And as for this picture, I probably just blocked the lens and that's it. That night when Jan got back to her house, she did not tell her husband Bruce about what happened to her in the tree stand because, again, she's telling herself it was all in her head. They have dinner, they clean up, they sit down in the living room, and they're both on their phones, and they're just kind of scrolling through the internet and their emails. And at some point, Bruce reacts to something he's reading. He makes a sound. And Jan hears him and says, oh, what are you looking at? And he said, you know, I just got a really interesting email from our nephew, you know, the one that goes to school down the road. He said that today they were outside for band practice, and at some point, all of them turned to look at the forest, and there was a bright circular light that was kind of hovering in the forest. And I guess they all stared at it for about 5 or 10 seconds. And then at some point, the light kind of went back into the forest and they didn't know what to make of it. And I guess one of his classmates said that a year before, the exact same thing happened. And it apparently scared their instructor so badly that they canceled rehearsal and went inside because of it. As Jan is listening to her husband read this email, she's sitting up and her heart is racing. And as soon as he finishes, she says, what time did he say that happened? Bruce picked up how intensely she was asking him. And so he looked at the email, looked back at his wife, and was like, it was between 7:50 and 8. Why? At this point, Jan revealed everything that had happened to her while she was hunting, you know, seeing that visual distortion in the trees that looked like a figure of some kind. And she would tell him that the forest she was in was the same one their nephew was claiming to have seen this circular light floating inside of. She told him she tried to take a picture of the thing she saw, but the picture didn't come out. But her husband, who is an optical physicist and therefore an expert at analyzing a picture, said, here, let me take a look at it. As soon as he looked at the image, the first thing he asked her was, well, did your hair get in front of the lens? And she said, no, I was holding it about a foot away from my head and my hair was in a ponytail and a ball cap, so that can't be my hair. And so he looked at it again and he asked her, well, did you put your finger over the lens maybe? And she said, yeah, I might have. I don't think I did, but it's certainly possible. And so not really thinking much of this picture, he decides before giving the phone back to just check the resolution of the image, because whenever he would examine a picture, that was something he would do, and he discovered an anomaly. It turns out Jan's BlackBerry was only capable of taking pictures in 3 distinct resolutions. Basically, the size of the image could only come in small, medium, or large. And this picture she had taken of this thing she saw in the trees was a resolution size that was not small, medium, or large. It was some random size that the phone was actually not capable of producing. And so he asked his wife, like, did you manipulate your resolution settings? And she said, no, I don't even know how to do that. So Bruce looked at the other couple of pictures she had taken that day, and all of those fell into the small, medium, or large resolution size. It was just this one picture that was a total anomaly. And so Bruce was suddenly really intrigued by this image and by his wife's story. And so he continued to study the image, and he kept asking his wife questions about, you know, how she was positioned in the tree stand and where the sun was and how far away this thing was and everything about the whole layout. And eventually Bruce started conducting experiments to see if he could duplicate this image his wife had created. And he got got pretty scientific about it, and he could not duplicate it. Ultimately, because Bruce trusts his wife did not alter the photo in any way, and he trusts his wife as being truthful about what she experienced in the tree stand, what she saw, and based on his years of being an optical physicist, Bruce believes whatever was in the trees distorted this image. That even if she had put her finger over the lens, which he doesn't think she did, and she doesn't think she did, the picture resolution was altered in such a way that something had to have an effect on it. There was a third-party effect on this picture. If you're interested in reading all of Bruce's scientific findings about this picture, I have included his write-up that he posted online in the sources below. In 2017, Daniel Beckwith was a 27-year-old genius hacker and prolific Bitcoin day trader. He was living in his modest childhood home in Bethesda, Maryland, with a multi-million-dollar fortune to his name. And he was hiding something major in his basement that when it was discovered by authorities, he would be convicted of one of the rarest criminal charges in the American legal justice system. But to understand this story, we have to go back to the beginning. Daniel was born in 1991 to his eccentric and brilliant parents, Linda and David. He would be their only child. David was a PhD and an accomplished opera singer that had trained under a famous French composer, and he had also performed at the White House. Linda was a Columbia Law School trained lawyer who at one time had been a government attorney, but she gave it up because she described it as a scummy profession, and she became a vocalist like her husband. When Daniel was just a toddler, he learned how to read, so it was clear he had unusually high intellect, which Linda guarded fiercely. She decided that public schools were not capable of teaching her son, and so she decided she would homeschool him. By the time Daniel was just 5 years old, he was consuming entire novels, and shortly after that, he was able to break down and reprogram his PlayStation. But despite his incredible intelligence, Daniel had a really lonely childhood. He was rarely allowed to go outside and play with other kids, and on the rare chance that he was, his parents always hovered around him the entire time. And few playmates, or adults for that matter, ever came inside of Daniel's house because Daniel's parents were big-time hoarders. You couldn't take 2 steps into that house before knocking into a big stack of papers or books or old food containers. In 2000, when Daniel was 9 years old, his father was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, which left Linda, his mother, to take care of both of them. And in that time, Linda became obsessed with protecting their property. And so anytime anyone walked in front of their house, just near their property, she would run outside and yell at them until they ran away. But despite their eccentricities, it was clear to anybody that knew the Beckwith family that Linda and David just adored Daniel. They just could not give him any space. One neighbor recalled seeing the 3 Beckwiths out trick-or-treating one year, all wearing the same matching hamster outfits. And this was well into Daniel's teenage years. Daniel loved his parents, but it was in those later teenage years that he started to realize just how smothering they really were, and so he began looking for other places to connect with new people. And he found a new community on an online forum called 4chan. There, Daniel got to reinvent himself. He adopted this kind of tough guy, genius persona, where he bragged about finishing most of high school by the time he was 15, and that nowadays he just blows stuff up in his backyard to test his chemistry know-how. But over the years of posting on this channel, Daniel would occasionally let his guard down, and he would talk about something that was really close to him, that pervaded his thoughts at all times, and would ultimately be his downfall, and that was his extreme fear of death. Daniel's isolation looked like it might come to an end in 2010 when he enrolled at the University of Illinois to study computer science and electrical engineering. His parents dropped him off at the Amtrak train station with all of his stuff for college. They said their goodbyes. Daniel hopped on the train and he waved to them as they disappeared, and he likened that experience to being set free. It was the first time he was going to be without his parents for any amount of time. But unfortunately, after only being at school for a couple of months, he had to go right back home again because his mother was diagnosed with cancer, and she had hid it from Daniel. In fact, she had hid it from everyone and not even seen a doctor. And so when Daniel got home, she was in really bad shape, and she passed away 2 weeks later. Including Daniel, only 3 people showed up for her funeral. And so Daniel, with his mismatched clothes and his pants that were too short, he gave his mother's eulogy, and in it, he just looked dazed, and he actually said, "I feel lost." And then shortly after Daniel went back to school, his father began declining rapidly from Parkinson's disease, and so Daniel had to put him into assisted living. And so living living by himself at his apartment in college, Daniel was overcome with grief, and now more than ever, he was just terrified of death because now he had seen it up close with his mother and he was watching his father wither away. And so he went back on 4chan and he began talking about taking a more defensive position against his own death. What that translated to is Daniel began researching what the most common killers were for people his age. And he discovered that car accidents were a big killer. And so he reinforced all the doors of his car with Kevlar plates, and anytime he drove it, he wore a Kevlar vest, which he believed protected him from blunt force trauma in the event of a crash. Knowing that cancer was a big killer, he went out and removed every mole on his body as a preventative measure. But what Daniel viewed as the biggest threat to his life was not something that statisticians would tell you is something people his age or people in his country should be worried about, and that was a nuclear attack on the United States. Daniel believed it was imminent. Daniel believed the only way he could protect himself was to build a proper fallout shelter. And because his mother had left him a multi-million-dollar trust fund, he had the means to construct one. And so he left college and went back to his home. He went down into the basement and he picked a spot right in the middle of the ground and he began digging. Over the next 2 years, Daniel spent part of his time living at college, being a really good student, and the other half of his time was spent living at his family home, hiring different contractors to come in and dig out this massive labyrinth of tunnels underneath his property. But in 2012, his schoolwork and his tunnel work had to come to a complete stop because he got in trouble with the law. Professors at Daniel's school began reporting that somebody was sneaking into their office, hacking into their computer, and then sending these really inappropriate and embarrassing emails to everybody in their contact list, which was primarily former and current students and faculty. And then whoever it was that was hacking their computer was then supergluing their door shut. After several months of investigating, the police finally got a suspect when students on campus said, yeah, Daniel Beckwith is actually a prolific hacker, and he just spoke at a hacker conference, so he seems like someone who would be capable of doing this. And so a detective went to Daniel's apartment to pay him a casual visit, but Daniel wasn't there or didn't come to the door, and the detective looked down and saw a package that was sitting there that was addressed to S. Loomis Detweiler. The detective believed this could be an alias for Daniel Beckwith, and so he went back and they ran that name, and sure enough, it was connected to an online persona that had recently been bragging about breaking into their professors' offices and hacking into their emails. So the police used this information to attain a search warrant. They went back to Daniel's apartment. He wasn't there. They used the key they had been given for the unit. They went inside and they're hit with just this ridiculous mess of an apartment. It looked exactly like Daniel's home growing up, with stacks of papers and books and wires and computer equipment and trash and old food containers. And there was just this dirty mattress sitting right in the middle of the apartment with no sheets on it. And in the back, on top of a mini fridge, was Daniel's laptop. It was open and it was unsecured, so they logged into it, cloned his hard drive, and left. And using the information that was contained on this hard drive, detectives were able to, without a doubt, connect Daniel to the vandalism and hacking that had been taking place at his college. Daniel was arrested and charged with a number of serious felonies, but shortly before his trial, Daniel struck a plea deal and then immediately took to Reddit to tell the world that he fully expected the state governor to pardon him because he had made a number of significant contributions to his campaign. But that pardon never came. However, Daniel's sentence was remarkably light. He was ordered to pay $23,000 in restitution to the college and then was given 2 years of probation. Daniel was expelled from his school, and so he moved back into his childhood home where he lived alone full-time. Once home, Daniel focused his efforts on this bunker he was building in his basement, which by now was a fairly large series of tunnels that zigged and zagged in different directions well beyond his property lines. Once Daniel hired a couple good contractors to continue to expand this bunker, he turned his attention to a new activity, Bitcoin trading. And in relative short order, Daniel became extremely good at this and made millions of dollars. By 2015, Daniel was off probation. His bunker was almost completely built out, although he did have plans at some point to hire more people and continue to expand it. And in terms of Bitcoin day trading, he wasn't doing it as much because he had made so much money. Now he just spent his time sitting inside of his bunker, live streaming on this new website called Blab about his investment prowess. And every time Daniel live streamed, he was cautious to never reveal his identity. And so he used the username 3-Alarm Lamp Scooter, and he wore a large fire protection hood over his face, and he used a voice changer. Within his small but avid following on Blab, there was one 19-year-old named Askia Kafra who completely idolized Daniel, even though he only knew him as 3-Alarm. Askia was from a middle-class home, and he was the son of immigrants from Trinidad. He also lived only 15 minutes away from Daniel, but he didn't know that because Daniel never gave up where he lived because he was so obsessed with protecting himself against a potential nuclear attack. He just told people he lived in some underground bunker in the middle of Virginia somewhere. Askia longed to be successful and rich, which is part of the reason he idolized Daniel so much. When he was 18 years old, he received a $100,000 settlement for a lead poisoning case, and he for a second got to live the life of someone rich and famous, and he blew it immediately on expensive dinners and rented Mercedes and BMW cars, and once the money was all gone, he was certain he could get it all back. And his big plan is he was going to build an app called Equity Shark, which is basically crowdfunding that allowed people to invest small amounts of money into new promising startups. And he believed this app was going to be the way he made not millions, but billions of dollars. But he didn't have any real money to fund this app. And so he and his business partner applied for a $100,000 grant for young entrepreneurs that have dropped out of college, something Askia had just done, and they were certain they were going to get this grant. But despite Askia's confidence, he was far from a sure bet for this money, because Askia still had many of the blind spots of someone still learning how to become an adult. And one of his biggest blind spots was how quick he was to trust people. And so it was shortly after Askia and his business partner had applied for this $100,000 grant that Askia came across Daniel on Blab, and he was so taken with him, and he's got all this money, and he's so successful. And that's when Daniel told his followers that he was open to new investments. And so Askia, who wanted to get closer to Daniel and figured he could use some additional money, because even when they got this $100,000 grant, they would need more money to build the business, he decided he would ask Daniel if he and his business partner could pitch him on Equity Shark. And Daniel agreed. And so in June of 2016, Askia and his business partner went to this hookah bar that was about 20 minutes away from Askia's home. And there they sat, waiting for 3-alarm lamp scooter to walk through the door. And they didn't know what he was going to look like, because whenever they saw him on his live streams, he had that big fire protection hood on. But as soon as Daniel walked through the door, they immediately knew it was him, because he had this comically bulky shirt on where it was obvious he had a bulletproof vest on. And so this guy with the bulletproof vest walks over, introduces himself as 3-Alarm, aka Daniel. And so by now, Askia and his business partner are very accustomed to 3-Alarm's eccentricities like his bulletproof vest. They just kind of overlook it and begin pitching him on Equity Shark. And they tell him that the success of the company, they believe, is hinged on this $100,000 grant that they explained they are certain to get. They meet all the parameters. They are exactly what they're looking for. And at the end of the conversation, Daniel was convinced that not only were they going to get this $100,000 grant, but that Equity Shark seemed like a great investment. And so after a number of follow-on meetings, Daniel ultimately committed $5,000 to Equity Shark, and he told Askia that they would have to pay him back with the funds from the $100,000 grant, or if for some reason that didn't come through, Askia and his business partner would have to find another way to pay back Daniel. Askia and his business partner were totally thrilled. They felt like that $100,000 grant is a done deal, so there's no risk to this investment by Daniel. And shortly after they secured the $5,000, the manager of the $100,000 grant program called Askia and said, "Hey, you guys have made it to the second round of applicants. We need you to fly out to San Francisco and pitch your company to us." And so they're totally excited. They tell Daniel that everything's progressing exactly as they planned. And they fly out to the West Coast, but they book their flight to LAX, not to the airport in San Francisco. So they land 400 miles south of where they needed to be. And so they're cussing themselves for being so stupid about this. And they realize they can't even rent a car. They're not old enough to rent a car. But they were old enough to rent a U-Haul. So they rent this huge U-Haul, and they start bombing up the coast towards San Francisco to make this meeting in time, but they plugged the wrong address into their GPS and did not go to the right building. They went in the opposite direction. And so by the time they finally got all the way back to the meeting place in San Francisco, it was too late, and the manager that was waiting for them was clearly upset about it and said, "Just go home, we'll be in touch by phone." Back home, Askia was totally embarrassed when he told Daniel about their botched trip, and he was convinced that they were not going to get the grant now because of how badly they had screwed up the meeting. And so Askia began asking Daniel if he would give them more money, because maybe if they use that additional money to bolster the app and make it more appealing, they will have a better chance at getting that $100,000 grant. Daniel eventually said he would commit more money, but Askia picked up that he was really hesitant and just seemed not to be very interested in Equity Shark anymore. And so Askia, hoping to stay in Daniel's good graces and wanting to make sure he was confident in this investment, he said, "Hey, let me do something for you. I heard on one of the channels online that you're looking to expand some of the tunnels inside of your bunker. Let me do that for you. Daniel, who was looking to expand his bunker, was eager to hire Askia, but he told him that if you're going to work for me, there's going to be heavy restrictions on how this goes, because it's a very secret location. I don't want this to leak out, where my bunker is, because as you know, there's going to be a nuclear attack on the United States any day, and my bunker is one of the only places that's going to be safe. Askia said that was totally fine. He would do whatever Daniel needed. So on January 28th, 2017, just after 2 a.m., Askia sat outside his house waiting for some car to come pick him up. And at some point, Daniel showed up in a minivan, and he walked up to Askia, he led him into the van, and then he put goggles that were blacked out on his head. And then Daniel drove around in loops up on the highway and back around neighborhoods, giving the impression to Askia that they were actually going somewhere far outside of Maryland, but really they were only going 15 minutes away to Daniel's actual house. And when they got to Daniel's house, Daniel made Askia keep the goggles on. Daniel got out and he led Askia by a string into the house. And once they got inside, Daniel had to carefully walk him around all the junk that was piled up all over the house. They made their way all the way to the back. They went down the stairs into the basement, where Daniel had intentionally created this unbelievable maze all over the basement floor with chicken wire and stacks of bikes and books and more junk. It was designed so anybody who was working inside of the tunnels, that even once they came out of the exit, wouldn't even know how to get out of the basement. And finally, after bringing Askia all the way through this maze, he stopped him right in front of this hole in the ground that was the entrance into the underground tunnels. And at that point, he told Askia to remove his goggles. Daniel told him to hop down and take a look. So Askia hopped down and he's looking around and he's seeing these massive tunnel systems pushing out in all directions, and all of it is extremely well lit. And he couldn't believe what he was looking at. And he's looking at Daniel like, how far does this go? And Daniel said, it's huge. It was at this point that Daniel handed down to Askia a pickaxe, a shovel, and a hard hat. And he explained to him that anytime you're in the tunnels, I'm going to have to cover over this hole, because I can't even have you in the basement. It's too much of a security threat for me. And in fact, I'd prefer it if you worked multiple days in a row, because anytime you leave, we're going to have to do the whole blindfold thing. And so you should anticipate living in the tunnels for days at a stretch. But don't worry, there's a mattress down there, there's Wi-Fi, everything's well lit up, and there's a 5-gallon bucket if you need to go to the bathroom. And so Askia, who trusted Daniel, didn't love this setup, but in a weird way, he was just kind of excited to be a part of this guy's life, this guy who he believed was just this really amazing person. And so over the following winter and spring, Askia would make the blindfold commute all the way to Daniel's house 15 minutes away, and then he would spend multiple days down in the tunnel chiseling away into these different tunnels that Daniel wanted expanded. But as well as it was going working for Daniel, Askia was dealt some bad news at the end of the spring when it turned out Equity Shark was turned down for that $100,000 grant. Askia was surprised, he was crushed, and he now knew he would have to pay back that $5,000 that Daniel had invested in Equity Shark, because he wasn't getting it from the $100,000 anymore. And so he asked Daniel if he could increase his hours in the tunnel to try to pay back that debt. Daniel agreed, and so on September 10th, Askia was back at Daniel's house, and he was down inside the tunnels in one of the lowest sections that required squeezing through a very narrow section that Askia had actually texted his friends about and said that section made him really claustrophobic, but he had to do it. He needed to pay back the debt. And so later that day at 4 p.m., when Askia was down in that lower section, the power in the tunnel suddenly went completely out. So it's pitch black. And so Daniel, who was upstairs, recognized it happened. And so he navigated through all the junk upstairs, came downstairs, navigated the maze all the way to the circuit breaker in the basement, and he flipped the switch and the power went on, but Daniel heard a loud buzzing sound coming from upstairs in the kitchen. And so worried that could be an electrical fire, he turned back off the circuit breaker, putting Askia back in total darkness down deep inside of this tunnel. And Daniel went back through this really epic maze in the basement, went up the stairs into the kitchen to investigate the buzzing sound, and as soon as he left the basement, he could smell smoke. And he turned around and looked down into the basement, and he could clearly see smoke was filling the basement. And so Daniel ran downstairs and he yelled out for Askia, and somewhere way down in the tunnels, he heard Askia yell out, "Hey dude, what's going on?" And Daniel's like, "Come on, you gotta get out of there." But he was totally overcome with smoke, and Daniel had to run back upstairs, ran outside, he caught his breath, and then he charged back into the house, down into the basement. But as soon as he got to the bottom of the stairs, he didn't see Askia, but he saw flames leaping out of the entrance into the tunnels. And he knew Askia was down there, and he's screaming for Askia to get out, but he didn't hear from him. And at some point, Daniel just had to turn around and leave because he was totally overcome with the heat and the smoke. A neighbor saw Daniel come running out, and they saw the smoke coming out of his house, and so they called 911. And so while Daniel paced outside screaming for Askia, Askia is down in total darkness. There's smoke filling up the tunnels, and he began making his way across that very tight section. But once he got out of there, he had no idea where to go because this tunnel system was huge and all the power was out, so it's pitch black, and there's smoke inside of the tunnel. And so he desperately starts crawling all over the tunnel. He's hitting dead ends, and finally, miraculously, he makes it to the exit of the tunnels. Everything around him is on fire. He leaps out, but now he's in a basement that's covered in smoke, and every time he had been led to that point in the basement, he had been blindfolded. He didn't know how to navigate the maze, and so he's looking out and it's all smoky, and all he can see is there's one window on the far side that he might be able to get to, and so he starts leaping over the chicken wire and the bikes, and he sneaks past a furnace, and it's just flames and smoke all around him, and he gets to this little shimmer of light, which is the window, except he realizes there have been metal bars placed in front of it. There's no way to get through it. But in his desperation, he grabbed a rolly chair and he put it in front, he climbed on top, and he managed to break the glass, but then he couldn't get through the bars. And eventually, after a number of agonizing minutes, he fell backwards and was consumed by the flames. After the fire was finally put out and Askia's body was finally found inside of the basement underneath that window, investigators didn't understand how Askia couldn't have gotten out of the basement, and Daniel tried to lie about it and say, oh, well, he might have been asleep, that's his bachelor pad down there. But eventually, as investigators were looking for the cause of the fire, they uncovered the entrance to this massive tunnel system. And that's when they realized Daniel had put Askia effectively into a death trap. When the fire started, Askia was at the bottom of this tunnel system, and so he had to navigate all the way back up to the top, killing all this precious time as the fire grows, and then he finally got into the basement, and there's flames everywhere, but he has no idea how to navigate the maze Daniel had made down there. And so he managed to get to the window because it was the only thing he could see, but of course Daniel had put bars in front of it, and so Askia had nowhere else to go, and he just died. The investigators would point out that where he died, he was only 2 steps away from almost certain safety. He just didn't know it. After an 8-month investigation, prosecutors charged Daniel with involuntary manslaughter as well as one of the rarest charges in the American justice system. It's called second-degree depraved heart murder, where Daniel's disregard for human life was so extreme it amounted to willful killing. And so he was sentenced to 9 years in prison. On July 12, 2015, 30-year-old Christopher LeCun was out on his boat with his wife, his kids, and his best friend Robert just off the coast of Port St. Lucie in Florida. Throughout the day, anytime Chris or Robert were looking down from the boat and spotted a rock pile, they would throw on their scuba tanks and dive down to attempt to find lobsters. Towards the end of the day, when they were looking down into the water, they saw what they thought was a rock pile at first, but as they kept looking at it, they noticed it had lots of straight lines, indicating it could be an underwater building. Chris and Robert noticed there was a yellow buoy floating on the surface right above where this building was underwater. And they thought they should probably go over and read it, but they decided, it's inconsequential. We can just go down and check it out for ourselves. Now, if they had stopped and gone over and read the buoy first, they would have seen there was a warning on it that was telling people to stay back at least 100 feet from this underwater structure. But Robert and Chris didn't read that warning, so they put on their scuba tanks and they dove down into the water. And after only going down about 10 feet, they noticed there wasn't just one structure underwater. There were actually 3 huge structures. And so Chris and Robert looked at each other and they're totally amazed at what they're looking at. They had been scuba diving together since they were young kids, and they'd spent a lot of time in these waters, but they had never seen these before. And so they were very excited to go down and have a look. When they got down there and they were only a couple feet away from one of these structures, Chris saw that the top of the building was just a square concrete slab, and then on all 4 sides there were big concrete slabs. But at the top of each of the 4 walls of this building were what appeared to be openings. They were almost like windows at the top of the structure. And across the window was mesh all the way around, like a grate, protecting things from going into the window and into the structure. And so Chris and Robert went right up to the mesh and tried to look inside of the structure just to see what was in there. But when they looked, it was just too dark inside and there was no way to tell what was in there. And so Chris is really disheartened because he really wanted to know what was inside of this building. And so he just grabs the mesh itself and just kind of tries to tug it in one direction just to see if it would even move, to maybe create some space so he could look inside. and it very easily slid all the way to the side, revealing an opening big enough for he and Robert to go through. And so the two of them look at each other and they just nod because they know they want to go inside and see what's in there. And so Chris went in, followed by Robert, and they found themselves inside of just this big empty space, this 70-foot by 70-foot space where there really was nothing inside of it, except down at the very bottom on one wall was this 16-foot wide opening that was the entrance to a huge tunnel. And from where Chris and Robert were at the top of the inside of the structure, they couldn't see into the tunnel. And so they decided, by looking at each other and nodding once more, that they would just go down and try to look to see if they could see through to the other side of this tunnel. And so Chris goes down first, followed by Robert, and as they start making their way down, they both start to feel a current that's pulling them straight down. And as soon as they felt that, they both intuitively knew that they didn't want to be a part of that, and they started swimming as fast as they could back up towards their exit. Robert, who was a little bit higher than Christopher, was able to escape the pull of this current and got up to the top of the inside of the structure towards the exit. Chris, on the other hand, was not able to escape this current's grasp and was actually pulled backwards into the tunnel where he disappeared. Robert had actually turned around and saw his friend get pulled into that tunnel, but he knew there was nothing he could do, and so he just turned around, swam out of the structure, and up to the boat as fast as he could to call 911. Once Chris had been pulled into this dark tunnel, he began tumbling backwards. He had no control over his body position. The current was just way too strong. And so Chris instinctively grabbed his mouthpiece and anchored it inside of his mouth, and then he grabbed his mask and did his best to keep that on his face. Because as he was tumbling, the current kept trying to pull those things off of him. As Chris tumbled through this pitch black tunnel, he began to realize that more than likely he's going to encounter some very powerful pump that's sucking this water through this pipe in the first place, or some huge turbine that has something to do with pulling the water through this pipe. And in both of those situations, once Chris reaches the end of this tunnel, he's going to get cut up and get killed. And so Chris thought about pulling his mouthpiece out to just end it right then and there to avoid this horribly violent death. But he thought about his family, he thought about his kids, and he just couldn't bring himself to do it. And so he just continued to hold on to his mouthpiece and his mask and just continued to tumble with no control in total darkness, having no clue where he was going. After over 5 minutes of this just nightmare situation for Chris, he suddenly sees a very small flicker of light at the very far end of the tunnel in the direction they're being pulled towards. And all he can think of is, okay, well, whatever that light is, that's the area where I'm going to get killed. There's going to be some pump or some turbine right out there. And so he's bracing himself for this terrible, violent end to his life. But as they got closer and closer and that light continued to grow, Chris got a better picture every time he would tumble around. He'd get a look, and it did not look like there were spinning blades of death or some pump in there. It actually looked like very peaceful, calm water with sunlight pushing through it. And sure enough, after he got shot out into this lit up area, the current kind of died down and stopped. Chris immediately began swimming right up towards the surface where there was actually land right in front of him. He was inside of what looked like this huge building, and he saw there were people walking around with hard hats. And so Chris just pulled himself out of the water and began yelling for help. It would turn out Chris had been pulled into a nuclear power plant's cooling system. This particular nuclear power plant used a multi-level system where instead of just pulling the water in directly into the plant where it would be cooled and there would be, a pump of death or spinning turbines or something like that, instead there was a reservoir first where the water was dumped, and then after a while that reservoir water would then get churned up into the cooling system. So Chris was just incredibly lucky that that was just the way this nuclear power plant was built, because many other nuclear power plants, if he had done what he did, he would have been killed in a really horrible way. Chris would ultimately sue the power plant, saying they didn't put up enough warning signs or enough deterrents to protect people from getting sucked into these intake pipes, and the power plant has countered by saying, we put up enough deterrents, you just went past them on purpose. As of now, it's unclear what came of that court case. In the evening hours of January 12th, 2016, 18-year-old Dylan Parker was attending a party in his hometown of Osborne, Idaho. Towards the end of the night, Dylan decided he wanted to leave the party, but it was snowing and cold outside, so he called his mom and he asked her if she would come pick him up at the gas station just down the road from the house he was at. His mother would say it was obvious Dylan had been drinking because he was slurring his words, but at the time, even though she was upset about it because he was underage, she thought, you know what, it's cold, it's snowing, I just want to get my kid home safe and we'll deal with this tomorrow. So she agreed to pick him up. She hopped in the car and began driving to this gas station, and as she's driving, she gets another call from her son. This time, he sounds totally panicked and scared, and he's asking his mom, you know, where are you? Where are you, Mom? And she's telling him, I'm going to be there in a minute. I'm just down the road. Calm down. I'll be there in a minute. And then he hung up. When she got to the gas station, he wasn't there. When she tried calling him back, his phone was off. She got out of the car and went into the gas station and asked if they'd seen her son, and they said they hadn't. She got back in the car and she drove around for about 30 minutes yelling for her son, but there was no sign of him. She still couldn't get in touch with him. His phone was still off, and she just had this bad feeling that something had happened to him, so she called the police. The police conducted a thorough search that started with the house Dylan had been at for this party. They interviewed the people who were there, and everybody said Dylan seemed fine, and he just left. He said he was getting picked up by his mom. But as they looked around town, they just could not find any sign of him. 10 days later, Dylan's body was found in an area nobody was searching. In fact, he was found by accident by two people that crashed their ATVs in the middle of the night and then went back in the daytime the next day to retrieve their ATVs, and that's when they found Dylan's body. He was located outside of town, high up a hill in a dense forest, which in order to get there, he would have had to walk the opposite direction of the gas station. Now, toxicology reports showed Dylan had been under the influence of alcohol, but this was his hometown. He certainly knew where the gas station was, and he would have known he was walking in the complete wrong direction, especially when you consider walking towards the gas station was like walking towards the center of town. There was lots of lights, lots of indication you're going in the right direction. To walk in the other direction towards that hill where he was found would have been like walking towards darkness, where there's no lights, there's no sign of town. It's obviously the wrong direction. But the case gets even stranger because on the day Dylan went missing, there was a lot of snow on the ground, which meant people would have made tracks. And from the time Dylan went missing until he was found, it didn't snow, and the temperature did not heat up enough to melt the snow. So in theory, any tracks Dylan would have made, they would still be there when he was found. But where Dylan was found, there were no tracks anywhere near him. No footprints, no tire tracks, nothing. It was as if someone had dropped him out of the sky. Another strange element of this case is Dylan was found without pants and without boots on. And so you would think for him to make it all the way up to this spot on the hillside through kind of rough, rocky, snowy terrain through a forest, that you would expect his socks to be totally ruined and his feet to potentially be cut up. But his socks were clean and his feet were uninjured. This led investigators to believe Dylan must have somehow made his way to that spot on the hillside in that forest without leaving any tracks, and then once he was there, he removed his pants and his boots. Except dozens of police officers and sniffer dogs were never able to find those pants and boots, despite the fact they should, in theory, be in that immediate area where he took them off. While he determined Dylan's cause of death to be hypothermia, the deputy coroner, David Roos, was convinced there was something off about this case. After local authorities came out and said Dylan's death was an accident, David became very vocal in the media saying he disagreed and he thought Dylan had been attacked. But the county never reinvestigated Dylan's case, and in fact, they went on to fire David Roos, the coroner, saying he was no longer qualified to do the job. David says they fired him to keep him quiet. As a result, we may never know the truth about what happened to Dylan. Dustin Self was born and raised in Piedmont, Oklahoma, which is a small community just northwest of Oklahoma City. Growing up, Dustin had always been kind of a mediocre performer with so-so grades, didn't take things too seriously, but in his senior year, he discovered weightlifting, and it seemed to give his life a much-needed sense of purpose, and it really kind of helped him organize all aspects of his life. So by the time he was graduating, he was not only in great physical shape, he had also managed to raise all of his grades up significantly, and he seemed to be on a path to success. But interestingly, after high school, he didn't pursue higher education, he didn't go get a job, he didn't try to spend more time with friends and family. Instead, he decided he wanted to go live in the wild. His family believed this was due to his obsession with the Hollywood film Into the Wild, which is about the true story of Christopher McCandless, who gives up a promising career to go live off in the wilds of Alaska. Christopher would ultimately die in the wilds of Alaska after eating a poisonous plant, or some say he died from starvation. So about about a year after Dustin's high school graduation, he was 19 years old. It was March of 2013. And he finally felt like he was ready to go live out this dream of living in the wild. And so he told his family he was going to go on this cross-country road trip, stopping at different points along the way, living out in the woods. His family knew he was really fixated on this and couldn't talk him out of it, and so they ultimately accepted it and said, just be really careful. So in early March, Dustin heads out on this road trip, and nobody hears from him until March 15th, when he calls his parents and says, I'm in this tiny town called Fields, Oregon, and I'm at a gas station. Everything's going great, nothing to worry about. The very next day, Dustin called his ex-girlfriend and told her he was lost on a mountain. And his ex-girlfriend said she couldn't really understand what he was saying, and she was actually at the airport about to board a plane, so it was noisy, and she stepped into a bathroom to hear him more clearly. But even as she's hearing him, what he was saying just wasn't making any sense. He was talking about this mountain he was lost on, and he was referencing that there were people that were after him, and it was just very confusing. And before she could get any more clarifying information from Dustin, he hung up, and then she couldn't get back in touch with him. So she calls Dustin's father, and she tells him that she had this really weird conversation with Dustin where he said he's lost on this mountain. And even though I didn't really understand what he was telling me, he sounded really, really scared. Dustin's father thanked her and then spent the rest of the day trying to get in touch with his son, but every time he called, it just went straight to voicemail. The next day, when he still hadn't heard from his son, he called the police. The police did not have a great idea of where to start looking for him because Dustin did not specify to his ex-girlfriend what mountain he was actually lost on. All they had was his last known location, which was that gas station in Fields, Oregon. So they went to that gas station and he wasn't there, and they asked the people that worked there if they remembered Dustin, and they didn't, and no one knew anything about him. And so after that, they just had to wait for more leads to come in because they couldn't just, search all the mountains in Oregon for Dustin. They would never find him. A month later, after no one's heard from Dustin, a ranch hand who was living in a very rural section of Oregon, not far from the gas station in Fields, Oregon, discovered Dustin's truck parked precariously on the edge of this road inside of a canyon. It was abandoned, but inside were Dustin's GPS, some food, and some energy drinks. His backpack that contained his sleeping bag and his tent were missing. There was a comprehensive search done around where the truck had been found, but after a couple of days, nothing had been found and the search was terminated. The area around where Dustin's truck was found was very hilly and rocky, but there weren't that many trees, which meant if you were standing on one of the different mountains in the area, you'd be able to very easily look out and actually see a road. And so the searchers were thinking to themselves, how could this guy have gotten lost on any of these mountains? Because all he'd have to do is look over there and there's a road and therefore there's help. 6 months later, a hunter was up in those mountains near where Dustin's truck was found, and he was actually moving through one of these small sections of aspen trees. And as he was walking through, he thought he saw a deer, and he was kind of stalking through these trees. And he gets to an opening where he looks down and he stops, because underneath the bush is an obviously dead man, not wearing any clothes, who's on his hands and knees, and it looks like his head is stuck in the ground. When the hunter walks over to get a better look, it looks like this guy must have pushed his head into a hole in the ground before he succumbed to whatever killed him. The hunter leaves and tells police. Police show up, they search the area, and they find a jacket nearby, inside of which is a wallet that contains Dustin's ID cards, as well as Dustin's car keys. The body was Dustin's. Dustin was located 9 miles away from where his truck had been parked on that road, and nowhere in the area did they find a campsite. They actually never found his backpack that contained the tent or the sleeping bag, so they think he never set up camp, but they don't know where his supplies went. After Dustin's family found out what happened to him, his father would say, I just don't understand why he didn't seek shelter in his vehicle. It was parked on the road, he wasn't that far away. Heck, he could have run those 9 miles. He was in great physical shape, and in theory, he would have known where he parked it, or if he didn't, he could have just walked to the edge of the mountain and looked out and seen the road it was parked on. So the family just couldn't understand his decision making. Investigators would say there was no indication Dustin was trying to hurt himself and foul play was ruled out. So what was it that caused Dustin to abandon his car and walk 9 miles uphill and ditch his clothes and ditch his backpack that contained his tent and his sleeping bag, and then stick his head in a hole until he died? The only thing that could be determined was that Dustin probably died of hypothermia, but because of the state his body was in from decomposition, the coroner said we don't know for sure. So like all the other missing 411 cases, we're left with lots of questions and not a lot of answers. In 2019, a 32-year-old United States Army soldier was stationed in Hawaii for training. This was his first time ever being in Hawaii, and so on his first day off, he planned to do some sightseeing. After doing some research, he settled on the Hawaii Volcano National Park as the first place he would go check out. This is one of the top tourist attractions in Hawaii that sees over 2 million yearly visitors. One of the main draws of this particular park is that it's home to one of the world's most active volcanoes, the Kilauea, that has been erupting consistently almost every year since 1983. On the evening of Wednesday, May 1st, John finally was given some time off, and so he hopped in his rental car and he made his way out to the park. When he got there, he was pleasantly surprised to see that it was not crowded in the least, most likely because he was there midweek. And so he paid his entrance fee, and then he started walking up a trail that would bring him up to this overlook that overlooked the caldera. The caldera of a volcano is the actual crater, the inside of the volcano where the actual lava comes out of. At the time John was at the park, the volcano was not actively erupting, and so there was no pool of lava inside of the caldera. However, the surface of the caldera, which was 300 feet below this overlook where John is, the surface was still 2100 degrees Fahrenheit, causing these massive steam clouds to billow up from it pretty much constantly. And so when John actually reached this overlook point and was looking out into the caldera, he was immediately disappointed because he couldn't see anything. And so as much as John craned his neck to try to get a better look down into the caldera, he was just totally obscured by the steam. Now, he was up against a safety railing that prevented people from getting closer, but he figured if he could just get right to the edge of this crater and he could actually look down inside, he might be able to see all the way to the base of the caldera. And so he looked around and noticed there were no other tourists up there with him. So he thought about it for a second and then decided, yep, I'm going to do this. And he stepped over the safety railing and walked right to the edge of this crater overlooking this caldera. And as soon as he got there, he suddenly had this unencumbered view of the space directly at the bottom of the edge of the cliff. He could actually see down into the caldera now. And so he got his phone out and he started taking some pictures. And then all of a sudden, the ground underneath him began to shift. And it shifted so quickly and so suddenly that threw him onto his back. And as he's laying on his back, scrambling to get back up again, the ground underneath him just completely collapses, sending him careening down 300 feet into the scalding hot caldera. When John fell, another tourist did happen to walk up another nearby trail, and they actually saw him as he fell. And so they called 911, and immediately first responders were on scene, but they were facing the same issue that John was, which is the steam was so intense inside of this volcano that you can't really see down into it. And so they had rescuers walking along the rim of the volcano, and they had helicopters in the air, but it really wasn't doing any good. And in the back of all rescuers' minds, they knew that realistically, there's just no way John could have survived this. I mean, you can't survive a 300-foot fall, but even if you did, you couldn't survive being at the surface of the caldera that's over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. You'd die within a couple of minutes. But the rescuers pushed that thought out of their mind, and they focused on being positive and just continuing to look for John. And 2 hours into their search, when it was totally dark outside and hope was just about gone at this point, somebody spotted John on a little ledge jutting out 70 feet down from that cliff he was standing on. When he fell, when the ground dissolved underneath him, he managed to land on this tiny little ledge. Had he fallen an inch left, an inch right, an inch forward, he would have tumbled to his death. There's no two ways about it. But he landed perfectly on the one ledge that could have saved his life. But he was so badly injured, he couldn't climb back up again. However, rescuers were able to rappel down to him, put him in a harness, get him back up, and he was able to make a full recovery.